Chapter 402. Imminent Disaster? Fang Xinjian smiled coldly and stepped out, stepping on the small snake's body. The small snake twisted crazily and let out a series of agonizing howls. Fang Xinjian, you're dead meat. I'm telling you, you're dead meat. I'm one of the 3 great unrivaled geniuses nurtured by the Serene Shrine. Today you've destroyed my army of dragons. The Serene Shrine will not rest until you're dead. Even if I were to die today, there'll be people stronger than me coming. You won't be able to fend them off. Let alone you, even the entire Great Western region can forget about fending them off. Fang Xinjian said calmly, You're just exaggerating to scare me. If the Serene Shrine was so powerful, how could they have been wiped out by the Empire back then? The small snake cried out, Wiped out by the Empire? You don't know anything. How can ordinary conferred knights be a match for us? Only the Krieg royal family, who occupies the center, and those divine-level experts have some influence. The only ones who can truly defeat us are the Holy See of Truth and the Mage Association. Fang Xinjian's eyes lit up as he asked, The Mage Association also participated in the war 25 years ago? Haha, are you trying to get information out of me? But so what if you know? After knowing about it, you'll truly understand the difference between black magic and night. You'll never be able to catch up in your lifetime, the small snake said, smiling coldly. Of course the Mage Association participated. They sent out that silver-robed lunatic. Silver-robed? Fang Xinjian frowned slightly. He knew that black magic was split into several factions. For example, his younger brother Fang Xingqian's master, the Black Mage King, belonged to the black-robed mages. However, he did not know which factions the Mage Association belonged to. You said that they only sent one person? One person is enough. The small snake looked at Fang Xinjian with a mocking expression. In front of a true expert, numbers are meaningless. Since ancient times, the silver-robed mages have always been passed down to only one person. There's only one silver-robed mage in each generation, but his battle prowess alone is comparable to 1,000 or 10,000 of you. If it wasn't for the Holy See of Truth and the Mage Association taking action together, how could we have lost? Your empire has long been occupied by us. Back then, the Empire's conferred knights had only participated in some peripheral battles and thought that their abilities were above ours. But how could they have the chance to participate in the core battles? Fang Xinjian's thoughts churned. Through his heaven's perception, he sensed that Fang Xinjian's emotions had not changed. It seemed like he was not lying either. Is the association really that powerful? He was aware of how powerful the church was, but he did not know that the wizards who had mastered black magic were even more unfathomable. Fang Xinjian asked again, According to what you said, the association's strength is about the same as the church's? Then why do they have so little land? The little snake's eyes turned into crescents as he let out a human-like sigh. The strength of the association is still slightly weaker than that of the church. Otherwise, how would the Holy See of Truth be the leader of this continent? As it spoke, the little snake looked at Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian, do you understand now? The Empire may seem powerful to you, but in the eyes of the real upper echelon, both the association and the church are things that can be destroyed at any moment. The reason why the Empire still exists is because both parties are wary of each other. This is why knights like you are able to survive. Haha, knight. Haha, although you have great talent, your starting point is wrong. Since you've taken the path of a knight, then you can forget about surpassing the association and the church in this lifetime. Your limits have already been fixed. Is that so? Fang Xinjian believed that most of what the little snake said was true. However, it was likely that he had also exaggerated the mage's abilities. Otherwise, how could the association possibly cower in fear? It was just like how he had defeated the other party today. Of course. The little snake stared at Fang Xinjian and said, Over the past 25 years, Our terrene shrine has put in a lot of effort to nurture a total of 3 unrivaled geniuses, all for the sake of dominating the continent and going up against the association and the church in the future. And I'm the weakest out of the 3. Moreover, there are countless bishops in the terrene shrine. They are all old monsters who have lived for over 100 years. Any one of them would be stronger than me. Fang Xinjian's eyes narrowed slightly. The little snake's abilities mainly came from the army of dragons, which even Sasa would not be able to defeat easily. Amongst level 29 conferred knights, he would be able to be ranked in the 3rd tier. He might even be at the top of the 3rd tier, and would be able to exchange a few blows with people in the 2nd tier like Governor Devitt. After all, level 29 could be said to be the stage where the difference in abilities was the greatest. Although they were both at level 29, 100 specialty seeds and 1,000 specialty seeds, 10,000 physical particles and 1.08 billion physical particles at perfection, 3 sets of techniques and 30 sets of techniques from killing techniques. When all these factors were added together, the difference in abilities was too great. Clearly, it was the same for those mages. Although Fang Xinjian did not know how they cultivated, the difference in abilities between them was like heaven and earth. However, ever since Fang Xinjian had fought against the knight who seemed to have used magic prints in the arena, and then fought against the bishop at the terrene shrine's base, he had seen the other party's magic, and he had a vague guess in his heart. Towards black magic, my body seems to be. He looked at the little snake and said, "You mean to say that I'm doomed because I've offended the terrene shrine?" "That's right." The little snake looked at Fang Xinjian with a venomous expression. He had said so much earlier in order to make Fang Xinjian feel great respect for the terrene shrine. "Your limits are there. No matter how hard you work, it's impossible for you to go up against black magic. Therefore, even if I die, there will be even stronger humans who will deal with you in the future. You're doomed." "Is that so?" Fang Xinjian said calmly. "Since you feel that I'm doomed, then bring me to the terrene shrine's base." "What?" Fang Xinjian continued. "Bring me to the terrene shrine's base and let them kill me." "How is that possible? Do you think that I'm an idiot? Are you afraid? Since you feel that I'm far from being a match for your mages, you don't dare to let me barge into your base?" Fang Xinjian looked at the little snake calmly and said. There was no way to tell what he was thinking from his unfathomable face. Right now, the little snake's mind was also extremely puzzled. He could not understand what Fang Xinjian meant. An ambush? There's someone else following Fang Xinjian? James? The second prince's faction? But I didn't sense anyone earlier. Did they just arrive now? Just as he was thinking about this, streams of sharp aura flowed out from Fang Xinjian's hand. "If you're unwilling, then I'm not willing to waste time either. You can just die." The little snake was stunned for a moment before he sensed waves of intense, killing intent surrounding him. Damn it! What's going on? What on earth is this guy thinking? What should I do? What should I do? Looking at Fang Xinjian's calm expression, the little snake was even more confused as to what he was thinking and what he was relying on. No matter what, if I don't bring him along, the outcome will be very bad. But if I bring him along and he's discovered, wouldn't I be betraying the terrene shrine? Just then, the killing intent in Fang Xinjian's eyes grew increasingly stronger. Still hesitating? Do you really think that you have a choice? Haha, Fang Xinjian, you guys don't understand how terrifying the terrene shrine is. It's impossible to get any information from me. You might as well just kill me. Chapter 403. Oh! Fang Xinjian exerted some force in his palm, feeling as if his body would be crushed at any moment. The little snake cried out in astonishment, "I can't bring you to the shrine, but I can teach you black magic. Don't you want to learn it? Black magic is several hundred or even several tens of thousands of times stronger than the Path of Knights. If you don't learn black magic, you'll just be cannon fodder your entire life." I can learn black magic now? Fang Xinjian said, narrowing his eyes. He had gone through a test in Demonic City, and he did not have any aptitude for black magic. The little snake was stunned for a moment before saying, "It does require some aptitude, but with your great talent, you'll definitely be able to do it." Just as they were conversing, Fang Xinjian suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the sky. From the eastern horizon, a black shadow was charging toward them at a rapid speed. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived above their heads. Fang Xinjian immediately said, "Hide." The little snake was also very clever. It wrapped itself around Fang Xinjian's neck, and its body twisted and changed. It was as if it no longer had any signs of life, and had turned into a necklace. Head of Department James cut across the sky and appeared before Fang Xinjian in the blink of an eye. Yaris followed closely behind him. James's face, which was extremely aged, now appeared even paler and dispirited. There were 2 abnormal patches of red on his cheeks, which were very eye-catching. Fang Xinjian was stunned for a moment before saying, "Head of Department, you're injured?" James waved his hand, his eyes filled with regret. "I had a fight with the Dark Knight and the others. I didn't expect that after the first prince went into seclusion, he would still be able to exert his powers across space with his clone. It's true that he has already reached the threshold of the divine level. My lifespan is nearing its end, and my abilities are declining. This time around, I was injured by him. Are you guys alright?" He lifted his head and looked at the battlefield that had turned into a barren land. His eyes were filled with astonishment. "Xinjian, it seems that you've gained a lot from your seclusion this time around." "It's true that I've gained quite a lot," Fang Xinjian said. "It's not just quite a lot," Yaris added. Putting aside those 2 assassins from the Sand Country, Xinjian single-handedly defeated Sasa and even wiped out that expert from the Serene Shrine. Saying that, Yaris described the feminine-looking young man's power in detail. "Finally," he said, "to think that you were able to wipe out the enemy's monster army in an instant. Xinjian, your abilities must have reached level 29, right? I even feel that you're not much weaker than the head of department and the others." Fang Xinjian nodded slightly to himself. Right now, without activating the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent, he could basically go up against level 29 experts at the 4th or 3rd tier. If he were to activate the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent, he would be able to go up against experts at the 2nd tier like James and Governor Devitt. However, compared to the First Prince and the School of Sword Art's Supreme Chief, who were level 29 existences at the 1st tier, he was still a far cry from them. James looked at Fang Xinjian in disbelief. In fact, no one could believe that in just half a year, Fang Xinjian's strength could actually rise to such a level. Good. I've finally been able to see you grow up before I die. Xinjian, if that's the case, you'll really have a chance in next year's national selection." James coughed and continued, "But this time around, Sasa was a conferred knight, and that expert from the Serene Shrine was definitely a genius from there. It's best that you don't let this news out. Otherwise, you'll probably suffer from crazy revenge." Fang Xinjian nodded. Of course, this was what he was thinking as well. Especially after hearing the little snake boasting about the Serene Shrine, he was even less interested in letting this news out and inviting endless pursuit. Of course, after a few more months, when his abilities had risen once again, he could consider doing this. Therefore, the news that James and the others announced to the public was that Sasa had escaped and disappeared, that the Sand Country's assassins had attacked Fang Xinjian, and that he had been killed. As for the Serene Shrine, there was no mention of it at all. Half a month later, another year had passed. At the beginning of the first month of the new year, Fang Xinjian was still in his training room, cultivating. Right now, he was only left with the last 3 years of his great limit of 5 years. Loud sounds could be heard from his organs and blood incessantly, and his body's internal movements were extremely intense. As he performed the 9-headed dragon sword technique, The potential points on his stats window continued to be depleted, and his attributes were increasing in all aspects. During this half a month's time, Fang Xinjian's increase in abilities had become even more terrifying. It was because the divine blood had given him a total of over 9 million potential points. Today, he had finally depleted over 8 million potential points, saving the remaining 1 million potential points so that he could use the Soundless Aspect and the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent at any time. However, the depletion of the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent was far too great. With 100,000 potential points per second, even if he had 1 million potential points, he would only be able to use it for 10 seconds. The depletion of over 8 million potential points was mainly used to increase his strength attribute, causing it to increase tremendously. His level had also risen to level 27 during this half a month's time, and even his mystical prince had advanced to the 7th level of the mystical prince after he had received the new 2 million potential points in January. The 7th level of the mystical prince had increased his aptitude once again, reaching an astonishing level. His specialty seeds had also increased by 101, and his attributes on his stats window had become: Name, Fang Xinjian. Age, 17. Occupation, Heavenly Sword. Sovereign Level, 27. Strength, 261 plus 16. Agility, 284 plus 16. Reaction, 183. Endurance, 161. Flexibility, 160. Ether synchronization rate, 85%. The attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 16 in strength and agility, 10% of the strength and agility attribute techniques. Boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, level 40 ether sword ripples, level 40 prodigious demolition sword physique, level 12 ether divine art, white bone divine weapon, Heaven's Volition Sword Intent. Internal specialties, 203 external specialties, 8 physical particles, 1000 waves, level 7. Prodigious astral divine powers waves mental cultivation method. Level 7 Universal Sword Dominance Lunisolar Tempering. His attributes had depleted his potential points, and his body's toughness had also increased to the level of a level 28 divine weapon. Fang Xinjian could be said to have completely digested the essence in the divine blood. This was especially so after he had stepped into level 27, where he could start to refine the energy from the physical particles in his body. With his heaven's perception, Fang Xinjian could sense all the cells in his body. He then continued to delve deeper and could sense the countless particles that formed up his body. He could sense that in each of the particles there were waves of extremely violent power brewing. Once they were unleashed, they would possess world-shaking prowess. Specialty seeds strengthened the physical body, allowing conferred knights to possess extremely strong and boundless physical bodies. Right now, the physical particles were the source of energy. Once conferred knights were able to refine the energy contained in all 1.08 billion physical particles in their bodies, they would no longer need to worry about their energy reserve. They would be able to regenerate and regenerate their bodies at will, unleashing all sorts of ultimate killing technique. Fang Xinjian could sense that there were 1,000 physical particles in his body stirring, ready to unleash the most violent power at any moment. Those were the 1,000 physical particles that he had refined during this period of time. At the next moment, he looked at his wrist. An eye suddenly opened up on a dark green bracelet. Fang Xinjian said calmly, "How is it? Have you thought of a way?" Chapter 404. Don't be anxious. The eyes on the camouflaged bracelet revealed a hint of panic. Your physique is special, so it's more difficult for you to learn black magic. I'll think of another way for you. After Fang Xinjian brought the small snake back, it had been trying to get Fang Xinjian to learn black magic. However, just like the results of the aptitude test in the past, Fang Xinjian was unable to learn any black magic. According to the small snake, black magic borrowed the powers of the gods beyond the heavens, using their powers to change the objective world. According to the different gods who borrowed the powers, there were a total of 12 types of mages: black-robed, gray-robed, silver-robed, and red-robed. However, Fang Xinjian was unable to establish even the slightest connection with the gods. Therefore, he was unable to perform black magic no matter what. It's fine if you can't do it. What about you? Have you recovered enough? Can you perform black magic now? A hint of displeasure flashed in the small snake's eyes. What do you mean by recovered enough? You haven't given me any time to recover at all. I want to eat meat, eat meat, eat meat. You must let me engulf flesh and blood for me to recover my powers. What's the point of resting every day? If black magic is really as extensive and profound as you say, it can't be that you can only recover your powers by engulfing flesh and blood, right? You should also have methods to increase your powers and take in energy, Fang Xinjian said. Try performing black magic on me. Fang Xinjian said, perform one that can be used directly. Don't use those summoning ones. But the black magic of us gray-robed mages mainly focuses on summoning life forms and energies from other worlds. There must be black magic that can be used directly on the target, right? Fang Xinjian's gaze was like a blade, cutting across the small snake's body. The small snake felt a piercing pain all over his body, as if he had been sliced open. The small snake was extremely infuriated. Other than engulfing flesh and blood, it was true that he could also borrow the gods' powers bit by bit and store them in his body. However, compared to the methods of sacrificing flesh and blood, pain, and other things in exchange for diabolic energy, it was too slow. It was like the difference between a small water pipe and a long river. Therefore, after half a month, the amount of God's power accumulated in his body was still pitifully little. However, looking at Fang Xinjian's expression, he knew that he couldn't drag it out any longer. He could only move his body helplessly and say, "Then I'm really going to use it. Don't resist. Bring it on." Fang Xinjian said softly. He wanted to verify his guess. A trace of viciousness flashed in the little snake's eyes. "Humph! You're not going to resist at all? You asked for it." In the next moment, a layer of gray light covered his body. It was the radiance of the terrible power that the Magi called God's power and the outside world called evil God's power. As the gray light gradually brightened, spikes protruded from the surface of the little snake's body, piercing towards Fang Xinjian's body. A soft clang rang out, and the spikes were blocked by the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. The little snake shouted, "I can't pierce in like this." Fang Xinjian nodded. A layer of skin peeled off from his arm. The heavenly abyss annihilation armor had retreated, revealing his skin. Then hints of electricity flashed on his skin. He had already removed most of the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces, lowering his defense. Is this guy for real? Seeing this scene, the little snake's heart skipped a beat. Although he did not understand why Fang Xinjian had suddenly fallen into a daze, he suddenly felt that this was a very good opportunity. To think that he has removed his defense. These knights are really all brawn and no brains. The corners of the little snake's lips curled up into a cold smile, and the spikes pierced fiercely into Fang Xinjian's arm. At the next moment, hints of gray light gushed out toward Fang Xinjian. Level 1 Black Magic. God's Resonance. This was one of the simplest forms of black magic. It was to sacrifice the object before one's eyes to the god beyond the heavens. Since it was a sacrifice, it had to be used on something that did not have any resistance or defense. Otherwise, not only would there be no effect, one would even suffer from the diabolic energy's backlash. Depending on the level of sacrifice, one would receive different levels of godly energy. And the god that the gray-robed mages believed in loved powerful flesh and blood, as well as living creatures filled with agony and despair. Ha 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 ha, Fang Xinjian, To think that you've really given up on resisting. You asked for this. Great excitement flashed in the little snake's eyes. However, not long after the gray light gushed into Fang Xinjian's body, all of the gray light disappeared again, as if nothing had happened. The little snake looked at this scene in a daze. What's going on? Fang Xinjian threw him a glance and said, Is it over? It hasn't started yet. A hint of anxiety flashed in the little snake's eyes, and the gray light on his body shone out once again. He had performed God's resonance once again, but there was still no reaction. What's going on? How can this be? This doesn't make sense. The little snake looked at Fang Xinjian's body in a daze. It was as if the entire world had collapsed. This doesn't make sense at all. The black magic of the gray-robed mages mainly consisted of sacrificing flesh and blood to the god. The god would then bestow them with power and then use the power of the god to perform all sorts of powerful black magic. The more powerful the black magic, the more powerful the godly energy and the more sacrifices would be required. Looking at this scene, the little snake suddenly broke off his tail and pierced the flesh spikes on his tail, starting to perform God's resonance. In almost an instant, his little tail shriveled up and turned into bits of remains that dissipated into the air. The sacrifice was a success. Then a hint of excitement flashed in the little snake's eyes, and he tried to sacrifice Fang Xinjian once again. However, it was still ineffective. 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 It was not the backlash from the failure of black magic. Instead, it was purely ineffective. It was as if he had not performed any black magic at all. Fang Xinjian looked at the infuriated look on the little snake's face. He watched as the little snake performed black magic time and time again, and the corners of his lips curled up slightly. Electric sparks flashed on his arm, and the toughness of his body recovered. With a shake of his arm, he shook off the flesh spikes. He thought, as expected, it's not my misperception. My deduction is correct. Black magic is ineffective against me. Then the power of Magic Prince. At the thought of this, his mind seethed. The fury, despair, and vengeance from that night instantly filled up his mind. At the thought of how diabolic energy's magic was ineffective against him, he had a strong urge to rush back to Demonic City immediately and fight it out with those Magic Prince warriors whom he had been thinking about day and night. However, his rationality told him that this was not the best time yet. But no matter what, if the power of Magic Prince was ineffective against him. Wait, I still need to wait. My abilities are still in a period of rapid growth. I'll have to wait until I'm at least level 29 before I go. I also need to test out the extent of effect black magic has on me. There's no rush. Soon. Li Shuanghua. Caroline. Wait for me. I'll be back soon. On the other side, the small snake stared at Fang Xinjian with an astonished and doubtful gaze. No one knew what it was thinking about in its roving gaze. Chapter 405. In the great western city, a pure white horse carriage drove slowly through the street. There were guards dressed in white clothes and armor in front and behind the carriage. These guards had strong physiques and wore solemn expressions. It was obvious that they were powerful warriors who had been through the battlefield for a long time. Wherever the horse carriage passed by, the people on the streets would all drop to their knees like waves, their faces filled with respect. There was no reason for this. It was because the people coming were from the Holy See of Truth, and the person in the horse carriage was an archbishop from the Holy See of Truth, a top-notch level 29 expert. Other than the Path of Knights, all members of the Holy See of Truth's clergy would cultivate divine arts, which borrowed the powers of the legendary God of universal truth. An archbishop from the Holy See of Truth was not just a level 29 conferred knight. He was also well versed in many types of divine arts, and his abilities were unfathomable. If most of the top-notch characters in the Empire were said to be at the second tier of level 29, then any archbishop from the Holy See of Truth would be able to be ranked at the first tier of level 29. Without a doubt, this was the strongest influence in the world. "Sir, we've arrived." In the horse carriage, a bald old man with a face as tough as a marble sculpture and eyes that were extremely deep walked down slowly. He looked at the small building and said, "Let's go in." A total of 12 white-armored warriors followed behind him. They were the second transition jobs from the Holy See of Truth, Radiant Knight. Each of them had 3 or more types of divine arts, and their abilities far surpassed that of ordinary conferred knights of the same level. The leader of the 12 white-armored warriors had golden prints on his armor, a blue cape on his back, and a head of golden hair that reached his shoulders. He looked just like a prince from a fairy tale. He was only half a step behind the archbishop, and it was clear that his status was also not ordinary. The archbishop said, "How was it, Gardener? How do you feel about heading south?" The golden-haired knight said calmly, "Each generation is worse than the one before. If there were no divine-level experts interfering, I would only need 500 second transition warriors to take down the entire South." "Haha, aren't you going overboard? This time around, there are still many geniuses in the central region. Especially the next king, George Krieg. His potential is astonishing. Also, Dongfang Ling, who became a national knight at the age of 14, can't be underestimated." The golden-haired swordsman closed his eyes and said calmly, "If you don't believe in gods, it'll all be for naught. However, this time around, I'm going to meet Fang Xinjian. The rebirth sword technique has indeed changed the world. But such a genius is actually unwilling to join the Vatican. How sad." The archbishop smiled. "Relax, Gardener. You're not working for the Holy Judgment Court." The two of them walked through the entrance of the building and saw that Governor Devitt and Head of Department James were already standing outside to receive them. Devitt was the only person in the entire Great Western region who could be a match for an important character like the Archbishop of the Holy See of Truth. It would be rude to send anyone else to receive them. The two of them shook hands, greeted each other, and walked into the hall of the small building. On one side were the Archbishop of the Holy See of Truth and his 12 guards, while on the other side were Governor Devitt, Head of Department James, Zhou Xingwen, Ferdinand, and the main character this time around, Fang Xinjian. The Archbishop said, "Then I won't say too much. This time around, the main reason why we're here is for Fang Xinjian and the rebirth sword technique. Lord Holy Orizon has already personally told me about the rebirth sword technique and is full of praises for it. I also think very highly of this sword technique." He then smiled in Devitt's direction. "Lord Governor is really good at teaching. Another unparalleled genius has appeared in the Great Western region." Governor Devitt's old face smiled like a chrysanthemum. "It's all Shi Zhan's talent." The few of them exchanged a few pleasantries and chatted about all sorts of things. Fang Xinjian only closed his eyes and cultivated his sword art. The governor, Zhou Xingwen, Ferdinand, and the others would naturally help him fight for the price of the rebirth sword technique's authorization in the north. After all, a portion of the authorization fee would have to be given to them. They were much more experienced and proactive than Fang Xinjian. Therefore, he would rather focus on cultivating his sword art. This was especially so after his mystical prince had reached the 7th level. His brain seemed to be even more agile, and he felt that his thoughts were unprecedentedly fast and clear. There were even all sorts of inspirations in the air gushing into his brain. Right now, he was practicing the killing techniques that he had scanned in the library in his brain. To think that he would be able to learn them just by thinking about them casually, and after thinking about them a few more times, he would be able to reach level 10. He would even be able to find ways to improve this sword technique if he continued to derive it. Fang Xinjian suddenly realized that after familiarizing himself with several hundred sword techniques, His sword art's level had increased tremendously. He had also memorized the thousands and thousands of sets of killing techniques in the library. Right now, he already had the accumulation to create his own sword technique. Just then, someone called out to Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian opened his eyes and looked in the direction of the Archbishop of the Holy See of Truth. He saw a warrior who had been standing behind the Archbishop walk out. The warrior was dressed in white clothes and armor with golden prints on them. He was also wearing a blue cape. He looked at Fang Xinjian, who seemed to have just woken up, with a hint of contempt in his eyes. The Archbishop introduced, "This is the Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardener. He is also the new director of the Holy Inquisition Court. He has been protecting my safety along the way." The Holy Inquisition Court was one of the 9 sacred divisions of the Holy See of Truth that specialized in investigating the internal affairs of the Church. It was filled with countless terrifying and bloody rumors. It was said that they were a bunch of fanatical believers, true lunatic. The Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardener, was a level 29 conferred knight. He was also proficient in several tens of universal truth divine arts, and was one of the rising geniuses in the Holy See of Truth in recent years. There were even people who thought that he had a chance of attaining the divine level. Hearing the Archbishop's introduction, everyone's gazes were filled with respect. However, Gardener merely turned his gaze toward Fang Xinjian and said, "I've already heard of your name when I was in the north. It's said that your sword art's talent is astonishing, and Lord Holy Orozen even recommended you to join the martial techniques grading plan. The reason why we're here today is to discuss the martial techniques grading plan with you." However, Gardener's next words took a turn and he said, "However, although you've created the rebirth sword technique, it doesn't mean that you're qualified to join the martial techniques grading plan. Those who are able to join this plan are either divine level experts or people who are at the pinnacle of level 29. They are great martial arts masters who have made a name for themselves for many years. In my opinion, you're not suitable to join the martial techniques grading plan." The martial techniques grading plan was a great plan that involved the entire world from the Holy See of Truth. It was a plan that would cost several hundred millions or even several billion. Naturally, it was a juicy piece of meat in the eyes of countless people. However, Fang Xinjian had rejected the Holy Orozen's invitation and did not join the Holy See of Truth. Now that he was going to take a bite out of this juicy piece of meat, the Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardener, was naturally unhappy. This was especially so since the part that Fang Xinjian was in charge of had originally belonged to the Holy Inquisition Court. One of the reasons why he had accompanied the Archbishop to the south this time around was to get to know the younger generation of the Empire. Another reason was to try and stop Fang Xinjian from joining the martial techniques grading plan. Chapter 406. Hearing that, Fang Xinjian threw an indifferent glance at Gardener and said, "You're not convinced?" Of course, Gardener knew how terrifying the martial techniques grading plan was. It was a huge piece of juicy meat. If he were to take a slice of such a big cake, it would be impossible for no one to look for him. He was not a divine level expert, nor was he a prince. How could others just watch as he took a share of the money? Such an arrogant attitude to others naturally infuriated the Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardener. He squinted his eyes, revealing a cold gleam as he said word by word, "With your qualifications, experience, and sword mastery, you're not qualified to lead a part of the martial techniques grading plan. I'm not only here to discuss this plan with you, but also to test if you're qualified to lead. Today I've seen that you're really just a young and arrogant genius. Young man, in this world, it's not the person who speaks loudly or has an arrogant attitude who is right." Hearing that, Devitt and the others frowned, feeling secretly displeased. However, the Archbishop continued to smile, as if he did not see this scene at all. Fang Xinjian said calmly, "Not everyone can see the bearing of a grandmaster. A worm in the summer will not be able to discuss ice with him, and a frog in a well will not be able to discuss the sea with him. If one's cultivation isn't high enough, it's only natural that they won't be able to tell. In that instant, a cold gleam shone in Gardner's eyes. If this was not the great western city, he would probably have made a move to teach Fang Xinjian a lesson on the spot. After all, according to the intelligence, Fang Xinjian had just completed his job transition half a year ago and was about level 25 or 26. Fang Xinjian had the battle prowess to defeat a level 27 conferred knight, but how could he possibly be a match for Gardner? As for how Fang Xinjian had defeated Sword Saint Sasa and pushed back the Terrene Shrine's army of dragon beasts, only Yaris, James, Governor Devitt, and a few others knew about this. However, Gardner did not make a move. He merely laughed and said, "I won't fight a verbal battle with you. It's fine if you wish to join the martial techniques grading plan, but you'll have to get past me first." "Get past you?" Fang Xinjian sneered and said, "Then get the Vatican to send someone else to negotiate." Gardner held his breath and looked at Fang Xinjian with an increasingly hostile gaze. As a member of the Holy Judgment Court of the Holy See of Truth, and the Holy See of Truth was the strongest influence in the entire world, Gardner was already over 30 years old and had already gone through the second transition to level 29. Wherever he went, he would be the center of attention and would be treated as an absolutely important character. When had he ever met someone as crazy as Fang Xinjian? "Young man, I don't like the way you speak." He looked at Fang Xinjian and said coldly, "When you're young, you should be more spirited and have the drive to improve, but don't be blindly arrogant. When I was your age, I also thought that I was unique and the best. But after a few years, you will realize how ridiculous this idea is. I'm telling you this right now. I hope you'll think about it when you go back today." Fang Xinjian said, "You'd better get straight to the point. What do you want?" Gardner shook his head and looked at Fang Xinjian with a regretful gaze. It was as if he was looking at a genius who had gone down the wrong path. "Let's test the speed at which we pick up sword techniques together." "Test the speed at which we pick up sword techniques?" Fang Xinjian asked. Gardner said, "That's right. You can offer 2 sword techniques for me to learn, and I'll offer 2 sword techniques for you to learn. Let's see who learns faster." The most important aspect of the martial techniques grading plan is one's learning ability and comprehension of sword technique. If one's learning ability is strong enough, and if one's comprehension of sword techniques is deep enough, they will be able to evaluate a sword technique's level faster. And with my level and talent, I'm probably not even in the top 100 in the Vatican. If you can't even win against me, then there's naturally no need for you to participate in the plan. As he spoke, his gaze was filled with strong confidence. Fang Xinjian's lips twitched. Who had he ever been afraid of when it came to the speed at which they picked up sword techniques? Fang Xinjian said directly, "What if I win? If you win, then I'll naturally support your participation in the martial techniques grading plan." With that, Fang Xinjian then looked toward the Archbishop, who was smiling like Santa Claus. "I have no objections. If Xinjian can win against Gardner in this aspect, then it means that your sword arts cultivation is astonishing and your understanding of sword techniques far surpasses that of ordinary people. You're a suitable candidate for the martial techniques grading plan." Fang Xinjian then looked toward Governor Devitt. Devitt gave it some thought and said, "It's fine. You can just use the sword techniques from our academy. Gardner, you can use the sword techniques from the Vatican. You just have to guarantee that you won't impart them to others after learning them." "Then let's begin." Gardner frowned and said, "Aren't you going to ask what will happen if you lose?" Fang Xinjian said calmly, "There's nothing to ask. It's impossible for me to lose." Hearing that, Gardner laughed coldly in his heart. He pointed to Fang Xinjian and said, "All right, but I'll still have to let you know beforehand in case you go back on your word. If you lose, you'll have to give up on participating in the martial techniques grading plan. Is there a problem?" You're so annoying. Let's begin. Seeing how arrogant Fang Xinjian was, Gardner looked down on him even more. To him, Fang Xinjian was just a person who had grown up in a small place and relied on his talent to achieve results. In the end, he ended up being extremely arrogant. What a foolish fellow. Your horizons have determined your achievements. It's not something you can imagine how deep the waters in this world are. To think that you can be so arrogant just because of your little talent. It's only a matter of time before you get into big trouble. Thinking of this, Gardner even felt a hint of resentment toward the Holy Orison. Why had he recommended such a person to join the martial techniques grading plan? At the side, James, Governor Devitt, and Fang Xinjian started communicating through information currents. Governor Devitt said worriedly, "Xinjian, the other party won't do something that he has no confidence in. I think we should forget about it. We'll just let Lord Holy Orison stand up for us in the future." That's right. James also tried to persuade him. That Gardner seems too confident. I'm afraid that he might have used some underhanded means. The entire martial techniques grading plan involved the flow of over hundreds of millions or even billions of gold. It was a massive project that spanned across countries. When it came to Fang Xinjian, even if there was only 1% of it, it would still be a huge sum of millions or tens of millions of gold. James and Governor Devitt had no choice but to be careful. Moreover, with such a huge sum of money, Gardner would naturally only bring up the idea of a competition if he had full confidence. Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, "Don't worry. In terms of learning sword arts, no one will be able to surpass me." Fang Xinjian then casually found 2 sets of sword techniques from the killing techniques in the library and wrote them down on a piece of paper. Gardner did the same, writing down 2 sets of sword techniques on a piece of paper. Seeing how casual Fang Xinjian was, Gardner laughed coldly in his heart. He lowered his head and looked at the 2 sets of sword techniques on the paper. Twilight sword technique and Templar sword technique? At the next moment, he closed his eyes, and a faint white light shone from his eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. At the next moment, a book that was emitting white light appeared in his hands. He pressed his palm on the cover of the book and let out a soft shout. The book moved on its own and flipped through the pages. When it stopped, the information about the Twilight swordsmanship and the Templar swordsmanship slowly appeared before him. Numbers started to jump up on his stats window. Twilight sword technique 1%, 2%, 3%, Level 8 Universal Truth Divine Art, Akashic Martial Techniques Manual. Governor Devitt and Head of Department James frowned. They both had a bad premonition as they looked at the strange sight before them. However, the Archbishop smiled and said, "This is the divine art that Gardner obtained after his ether synchronization rate reached 100% and he prayed to the gods. Akashic Martial Techniques Manual. The God of Universal Truth knows everything about the entire world and the entire universe, and the Akashic Martial Techniques Manual records all the martial techniques in the past and future. Gardner can spend half an hour every day to learn 3 martial techniques to the maximum level from the manual. Although he cannot impart them and will forget them the next day, it is still a miraculous power. This is the greatness of the gods." The Archbishop looked at Fang Xinjian, who seemed to be in a daze, and said, "God of Universal Truth, everything was born from you, and everything was nurtured by you." Head of Department James said in astonishment, "Why haven't I heard of such a divine art before?" The Archbishop smiled and said, "The God of Universal Truth knows everything in this world. The divine arts that he can impart are naturally things that we will never be able to learn even if we spend our entire lives." Gardner's faith touched the gods during an exchange with them. That's why he was bestowed with this divine art. Chapter 407. The Holy See of Truth's divine arts were bestowed upon the cultivator in the process of praying to the God of Universal Truth time and time again. As the cultivator's faith grew stronger and stronger, the divine arts would be bestowed upon them. There was no way to research, pass down, or learn them. Hints of astonishment flashed on the faces of Governor Devitt and head of Department James. This divine art was far too powerful. Moreover, the Holy See of Truth, who possessed this divine art, had unfathomable abilities. Zhou Xingwen and Ferdinand exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with astonishment and worry. Since young, they had heard of the endless prowess of universal truth divine arts, and that the Holy See of Truth was the #1 influence in the world. However, they had not expected that there would be such an unbelievable divine art. In that case, with this divine art, wouldn't Gardner be the best in the world in terms of learning speed? Ferdinand looked toward Fang Xinjian, who was looking at the sword techniques written on the paper in a daze. Sigh, it seems that Xinjian won't be able to participate in the martial techniques grading plan. That's a few million or even 10 million worth of money and countless sword arts manuals. It's a pity, a pity. Gardner looked at the jumping numbers on his stats window. Twilight sword technique 11%. 12%. 13%. He then looked at Fang Xinjian, who was in a daze, and laughed coldly in his heart. In terms of learning speed, there was no way he would lose. However, just then, Fang Xinjian stood up. He had just gone through the sword techniques written on the paper by Gardner. They were a set of Universal Truth longsword and a set of Star of Adjudication, respectively. These two sets of sword techniques were not difficult, and there were only a few thousand words written on the paper. Fang Xinjian went through them in his mind, and went through a series of deductions before he managed to learn the Universal Truth longsword and Star of Adjudication. He then stood up and clenched his hand. Streams of water vapor gathered together, turning into a water sword. Next, the longsword danced and a set of Universal Truth longswords was displayed. This set of Universal Truth longswords was one of the famous sword techniques of the Holy See of Truth. It was created based on the teachings of the Holy See of Truth and after countless generations of deductions. As soon as Fang Xinjian performed this swordsmanship, there was a sense of grandeur and grandeur. This set of swordsmanship was extremely upright and could be said to be extremely domineering. After the swordsmanship was performed, it was as if everything else was excluded, and there was only a sense of solitude within it. The Universal Truth was the only one, and so was the Universal Truth God. The Universal Truth sword technique also contained a state of being the only one in the entire world. On the other hand, Gardner had wanted to mock Fang Xinjian for overestimating himself and drawing his sword after taking a few looks. However, when he saw the scene of Fang Xinjian performing the Universal Truth longsword, he was so astonished that his eyeballs almost popped out. How long had it been? It had not even been a minute. Fang Xinjian had even felt that it was too slow to look through the entire Universal Truth longsword. To think that Fang Xinjian had already learned it? Moreover, the more Fang Xinjian performed the Universal Truth longsword, the more astonished Gardner was. It was because Fang Xinjian's Universal Truth longsword was improving crazily with every passing minute and second. For the first sword, he was like an inexperienced novice. For the second sword, he was already on point. For the third sword, it was as if he had been practicing it for several years. By the time he reached the fourth and fifth sword, it seemed as if he had been practicing it for several decades and was extremely proficient in it. Thereafter, as Fang Xinjian continued to perform his sword moves, waves of powerful repulsive force came from the water sword in his hand. Everyone felt an invisible force gushing toward them, as if wanting to push them far away. The furniture and accessories in the surroundings were blown away one after another, dropping onto the ground. The layers of soil under their feet were plowed and swept away. This force grew increasingly greater and stronger, and in the blink of an eye, it had formed a vacuum zone within 10 meters around Fang Xinjian. Gardner felt extremely bitter. It was because the cultivation of the universal truth longsword that Fang Xinjian was displaying was no longer inferior to his. Ferdinand was the one with the lowest cultivation. When he saw this scene, he asked puzzledly, "What sword technique is this? Did Xinjian use the reduced force field to throw everything out?" "It's not the reduced force field. This is the universal truth longsword," head of department James said with a sigh. The universal truth longsword is a sword technique that was developed based on the teachings of the Holy See of Truth, which states that there is only one truth in the world. It emphasizes on being the only one in the world. It must be extremely domineering and egoistic, nurturing a disposition that encompasses the 9 heavens and is the only one in the world. This sword technique isn't just about the cultivation of sword theories. It's also about nurturing one's disposition and character. It might not be comparable to many other sword techniques in the beginning, but the further one cultivates it, the more terrifying its prowess will be. Right now, the reason why Xinjian is performing the universal truth longsword is to push out all matter that is not him. Right now, there is nothing within a 10-meter radius of him. This is the cultivation of the universal truth longsword, which is above level 20. Ferdinand said excitedly, "Then Xinjian has succeeded? He picked up the sword technique even faster than the other party?" James stared at the longsword in Fang Xinjian's hand and said, "That's not all." Fang Xinjian's actions did not stop. The longsword in his hand danced increasingly slower. However, the slower it was, the more everyone could sense an extremely violent power gathering on the longsword, as if wanting to suppress and push out everything. Finally, at the next moment, even light started to distort. The area within 10 meters from where Fang Xinjian was became increasingly dark, and everyone was gradually unable to see what was going on. This. James's mouth was agape as he said, "Has he attained a breakthrough to level 20? To think that even light is being distorted and pushed out." Governor Devitt also stared at Fang Xinjian, his eyes flashing with great astonishment and surprise. The Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardner, looked at Fang Xinjian, who was gradually being encompassed by darkness. A myriad of thoughts ran through his mind, stirring up great waves. How could he not be astonished? How could he not be astonished? The universal truth longsword that Fang Xinjian was performing right now was so profound that it had already surpassed his level. Or rather, it should be said that Gardner had only seen 4 or 5 people who had achieved such a level of universal truth longsword despite having been in the north for so long. "Fang Xinjian, who on earth are you?" Looking at the area within 10 meters which had turned pitch black, Gardner could not help but feel suspicious. Could it be that he has learned the universal truth longsword before? Just as Gardner was thinking of this, a gust of cold wind gushed forth, and he subconsciously shivered a little. However, at the next moment, he reacted. He lifted his head and stared at the darkness with eyes as wide as those of a bull. James opened his mouth and moved a little, but he did not say anything. However, Governor Devitt sighed and said, "Even the heat is starting to be repelled. The temperature in the dark area continues to drop." Large areas of frost started to spread out from the edges of the darkness, continuously freezing the ground and floor. Gardner was astonished. It was because he had never heard of anyone who had cultivated the universal truth longsword to such a level, let alone seen it before. "Impossible," Gardner suddenly said with a cold expression. "It's impossible for anyone to cultivate the universal truth longsword to such a level within a few minutes. You must have cultivated the universal truth longsword in the past. There's only one possibility." Chapter 408. Hearing Gardner's words, the countenances of both Governor Devitt and Head of Department James turned a little grim. Ferdinand said directly, "Humph, you're not going to admit it after losing? Based on what you said, as long as Xinjian learns faster than you, it means that he has learned it before." Then have you ever heard of anyone cultivating the universal truth longsword to such a level within a few minutes? There has never been such a person throughout history, Gardner said coldly. Other than the fact that he has learned the universal truth longsword in the past, I can't think of any other explanation. The Archbishop nodded slightly. Fang Shijian's performance was too astonishing. It was impossible for him to cultivate the universal truth longsword to such a level within a few minutes. Just then, the darkness domain gradually dissipated, and Fang Shijian stopped practicing the universal truth longsword. The universal truth longsword in his stats window was now at level 40. The attacking prowess of this sword technique was not strong, and it was not of much help to the Zenith Light Sword formation, Ether Sword Ripples, and Prodigious Demolition Sword physique. However, it possessed extremely strong defensive prowess. Therefore, Fang Shijian did not plan on synthesizing this set of sword technique before he reached level 29. Instead, he kept it for defense. With that, Fang Shijian set up the Zenith Light Sword formation for long-distance attacks, the Ether Sword Ripples for medium to short-distance support, the Prodigious Demolition Sword physique for close combat, and the Universal Truth Longsword for defense. He had completely perfected his current three-dimensional battle structure. After consolidating the sword theories in his mind, Fang Shijian turned to look at Gardner and said, "You're not going to admit it?" Gardner's countenance turned grim as he stared at Fang Shijian and said, "Fang Shijian, to be able to learn the universal truth longsword within a few minutes and even cultivate it to such a level. Are you trying to bluff a fool?" At this moment, Gardner could only put up a strong front. Moreover, he did not believe that someone could learn and cultivate the universal truth longsword to such a level within a few minutes. Even James, Governor Devitt, and the others had similar suspicions. A few months ago, when Fang Shijian was challenging the Killing Techniques Palace, he had needed 1 to 2 hours to learn a set of sword technique. He would also need a few days to cultivate it to the maximum level. All in all, Fang Shijian's performance just now was not only stunning, but also horrifying. Fang Shijian only shook his head and looked at the other sword technique on the paper. Star of Adjudication said, "What if I were to learn this sword technique within 1 minute? Learn the Star of Judgment in a minute." Gardner frowned and could not help but suspect if the other party had learned the Star of Adjudication sword technique before. However, after thinking about the characteristics of the Star of Adjudication, he felt that it was unlikely. It was because the Adjudicating Heart was a unique sword technique of the Holy Judgment Court. It was not because they did not teach it to outsiders, but because the Adjudicating Star could only be cultivated by those who had faith in the God of Truth. The stronger the faith, the more powerful the sword technique would be. If one did not have faith or did not respect the God of Universal Truth, not only would they be unable to display the prowess of their sword arts, they might even end up harming themselves. This Fang Shijian is not a believer of the truth. The possibility of him cultivating the Star of Judgment is too small. If he has cultivated the Star of Judgment and is a believer of the truth, why would he dare to go against me? On the other side, Fang Shijian laughed inwardly and looked at Gardner, saying, "How about it? If I were to learn the Star of Adjudication within a minute, what else do you have to say?" Gardner thought that he had figured out the truth. After hearing Fang Shijian's words, he felt that he was putting on an act. Moreover, at this point, Gardner did not have any other choice. Therefore, he said coldly, "If you can really learn the Star of Adjudication within a minute, I'll naturally agree to you joining the martial techniques grading plan." Fang Shijian smiled and threw another glance at the Star of Adjudication. Then he swung his longsword, and a spot of white light rose up from the tip of the sword. He performed a simple, ordinary, and seemingly powerless sword technique. A spot of faint white light lingered on the tip of the water sword in his hand, as if it would be extinguished at any moment. When Fang Shijian performed this set of sword technique, he only felt an extreme distortion. It was as if there were countless voices shouting out in his body, and it was also as if there was an invisible force in the world that was preventing him from continuing to perform the sword technique. He felt that after performing this set of sword technique, he could not even unleash 10% of his original battle prowess. It was extremely unbearable. Moreover, as he performed each move, he felt that the resistance all over his body was getting increasingly stronger. Streams of light appeared all over his body, looking like countless light threads that were rubbing against each other. Despite this, he still managed to rely on his unrivaled sword arts talent to perform the entire set of the Star of Adjudication. An additional Level 1 technique for the Star of Adjudication appeared on his stats window. Ferdinand asked anxiously, "What's going on? Why does it seem as if Xinjiang has successfully performed it, but this set of sword technique? This set of sword technique looks very ordinary, right?" Head of Department James shook his head. "This is the Holy See of Truth's Star of Adjudication. Those who don't have faith in this set of sword technique will look very ordinary after performing it. Their battle prowess might even decrease instead of increasing. And for those who believe in the God of universal truth, after performing this set of sword technique, it will be as if they have the help of God and are omnipotent." Governor Devitt looked toward Gardner and said, "It hasn't even been a minute. The phenomenon that Xinjiang experienced earlier should be a backlash after performing the Star of Adjudication. This means that he has learned the Star of Adjudication and communicated with the God of universal truth. It's just that he did not succeed because he doesn't have faith in him." Gardner stared at Fang Xinjiang, a myriad of thoughts running through his mind. It was as if he was thinking about how on earth Fang Xinjiang had managed to learn the Star of Adjudication within a minute. Although Fang Xinjiang had only learned the basics of this set of sword technique, Gardner could clearly remember that back when he was learning the Star of Adjudication, even with his extraordinary talent and firm faith in the God of universal truth, he had only been able to successfully perform it after learning for an entire day. However, Fang Xinjiang had managed to learn it with just a glance. Fang Xinjiang looked at Gardner and said, "Why? Are you still not convinced?" Looking at Fang Xinjiang's disdainful gaze, Gardner felt even more infuriated. However, just then, the Archbishop patted him on the shoulder and asked Fang Xinjiang, "Xinjiang, have you really never learned the Universal Truth Longsword and the Star of Adjudication before?" "Of course not." The Archbishop nodded. "All right, Gardner. Xinjiang didn't lie. You've really lost." Gardner was slightly stunned and looked toward the Archbishop. He knew that the Archbishop knew a Level 4 divine art called Truth and Falsehood, which could determine if a person was lying or not. Since even the Archbishop had admitted to it, it meant that Fang Xinjiang had indeed managed to learn the two sets of sword techniques within a few minutes. A creepy feeling welled up in Gardner's heart. He lifted his head and looked at Fang Xinjiang, feeling a hint of terror. To be able to learn the two sets of sword techniques within a few minutes and even cultivate the Universal Truth Longsword to such a level. What kind of monstrous talent was this? At the thought of how Fang Xinjiang had been learning and improving at such a speed every day, Gardner was astonished and then on his guard. However, a hint of doubt gradually appeared in the Archbishop's eyes. When he first saw Fang Xinjiang, he had felt a sense of familiarity. Right now, the more he looked at Fang Xinjiang, the more he felt that Fang Xinjiang's face looked very familiar. It was only at the next moment that a hint of astonishment flashed in his eyes. Chapter 409. The Archbishop's eyes were suddenly filled with astonishment. He could not help but stand up abruptly, and the chair under his feet instantly turned into dust. Seeing how shocked the Archbishop was, everyone present was also astonished. They looked at the Archbishop, not knowing what had happened to him. The Archbishop's eyes were fixed on Fang Xinjiang, as if he had seen something unbelievable. Fang Xinjiang turned his head and asked, "What's wrong?" "No. Nothing. Why are you?" No. In that instant the archbishop started to speak incoherently. It could be seen that he was greatly shaken. However, he was the archbishop after all. After a short moment, he took in a deep breath and calmed down completely. He took another deep breath and said, Xinjiang, with your talent and sword arts cultivation, it won't be a problem for you to participate in the martial techniques grading examination. I'll report the results of this examination, and the higher-ups will soon send us news. I'll stay for a few days and slowly tell you about the details of the funds and the plan. Gardner looked at the archbishop in surprise. The archbishop was a person who held a high position in a parish. In many small countries in the north, his status was even higher than that of the king. However, at this moment Gardner could hear a hint of fear in the archbishop's tone that was hard to detect. Therefore, under everyone's surprised gazes, the archbishop became extremely cooperative. In the next few days, he and Fang Xinjiang had a friendly discussion about the details of the martial techniques grading plan. Fang Xinjiang was in charge of about 1% of the progress, which was about 1,000 sets of sword technique. The Holy See of Truth would provide about 15 million gold, which would be transferred to his account in 10 installments. The speed of the transfer would be calculated based on Fang Xinjiang's progress in completing the sword techniques assessment. For every 100 sets of sword techniques completed, 5 million gold would be transferred to his account. One could imagine how much money the Holy See of Truth would need to spend just to collect the martial techniques for the entire martial techniques grading plan. The amount of money needed for the preparatory work for this plan was enough to cause many small countries to collapse. The specific evaluation would be based on the information provided by the Church of Universal Truth, taking into account the comprehensive evaluation of each sword technique's control, destructive prowess, explosive prowess, learning difficulty, and other aspects. There was a total of 7 grades, S, A, B, C, D, E, and F. In this aspect, the Holy See of Truth was very detailed. Basically, every value was very specific. For example, how high the temperature was, what was the destructive power of the explosion, what was the speed of acceleration, all of these were very detailed lists. The large number of manuals could almost fill up an entire room, and there were also 1,000 copies of the specific information and cultivation methods of the sword art. One could imagine how much work it would take. As for the price of the authorizations for the rebirth sword technique, due to the change in the archbishop's attitude, Ferdinand and Zhou Xingwen's progress was even more gratifying. A few days later, in the school cafeteria, Fang Xinjiang was sitting at the dining table, waiting for his food to be served. He closed his eyes, and various sword techniques flashed through his mind. He did not stop practicing his sword techniques even as he waited for his food. Just then, Rhoda walked over. This female knight, who had once vowed to catch up to Fang Xinjiang, had shaved her hair short in just a few months' time. Her eyes were filled with a heroic spirit, and her limbs seemed to have become even more slender. Coupled with her tall figure, she seemed to have become even more enchanting. When she saw Fang Xinjiang at the dining table, the corners of Rhoda's lips curled up uncontrollably. She walked up and sat down. "You've been cooped up in the sacred land all day long. It's really not easy to find you." Fang Xinjiang looked at her happy expression and asked, "What's the matter?" "I've succeeded in my second transition, becoming a flame dragon knight." Rhoda said, "The flame dragon knight can condense a solar flame dragon, which makes up for the weakness of my killing technique, which is lacking in prowess." She looked at Fang Xinjiang. For some reason, she had wanted to run over to tell Fang Xinjiang after she had succeeded in her second transition. Fang Xinjiang nodded. "That's a good thing. You're considered a genius to have succeeded in your second transition in your 20s. Who would dare to claim to be a genius in front of you now? To have learned 2 sets of sword techniques within 3 minutes, and have even reached the maximum level for the Universal Truth longsword. This news has spread throughout the entire Great Western City." Rhoda's beautiful eyes assessed Fang Xinjian deeply, as if she was testing him. Fang Xinjian smiled calmly. You don't believe me? Rhoda said, to be honest, if it were someone else, I wouldn't believe it at all. But since it's you, I'll have to give it some consideration. That's why I rushed over to ask you. Just then, the shadows on the ground trembled, and the second transition death's shadow, Anderson, darted out from the shadows. He stared at Fang Xinjian and said, I heard that you've reached the maximum level for the Universal Truth longsword within 3 minutes. Is that true? After hearing this news, Anderson tossed and turned in bed for a few days, unable to sleep. The 2 dark circles under his eyes made him look like a panda's eyes. If it's true and Fang Xinjian's talent has really reached such a level, then wouldn't I never have the chance to catch up to him in this lifetime? Fang Xinjian looked at the 2 of them, nodded casually, and said, It's true. What's the matter? Both Rhoda and Anderson did not say a word. The 2 of them remained silent, their eyes filled with perplexity, bewilderment, and helplessness. To find out that Fang Xinjian had only taken a few minutes to complete something that they would have needed to spend several months or even 1 or 2 years to do was a devastating blow to their confidence. Fang Xinjian could not help but say, There's no need for you to compare yourself to me. We're different. What's the difference? Anderson said angrily. Fang Xinjian, are you looking down on me? In your eyes, are we all very stupid? Did you feel like laughing when you saw us cultivating? Fang Xinjian shook his head. Just then, Diana brought 5 waiters over with the dishes. This is the golden lobster. The golden lobster is a level 29 ferocious beast. Its outer shell is too tough, so I got Lord Zhou Xingwen to personally cut off the outer shell and remove the cavity before disassembling the lobster. On a huge plate that was about 1 meter long, there was a huge lobster with only the golden lobster meat left. It was placed quietly on the plate. Regardless of whether it was the meat in the pincers or the flesh on the torso, everything was perfectly preserved. There was no damage at all. For the sauce, I used royal butter from the north and ferocious pheasant soup that had been simmered for 12 hours. I stirred it in a 1-to-1 ratio and even added a little wine. Have a taste. Fang Xinjian looked at the golden lobster that the 5 waiters had put in a lot of effort to carry onto the table. The corners of his lips could not help but curl up. He gestured to Rhoda and Anderson. The 2 of you can try it too. Rhoda gulped. Looking at the tender, juicy, golden lobster that was exuding an alluring fragrance, she could not help but ask, a level 29 golden lobster? How much does it cost? Fang Xinjian casually cut up a piece of lobster meat, dipped it in the sauce, and swallowed it in 1 gulp. The sweet taste of the lobster mixed perfectly with the sauce's freshness and saltiness. Coupled with the wine's fragrance, it made him smile once again. Hearing Rhoda's words, he said calmly, I spent 100,000 gold. It's a specialty from the Federation. I got Zhou Xingwen to help me buy it. Anderson had just eaten it when he spat out the 100,000 gold. Then his palm brought up a series of afterimages as he quickly received the lobster meat and swallowed it in 1 gulp. 100,000 gold. Are you crazy? 100,000 gold for a meal? Chapter 410. Rhoda also gulped down a mouthful of saliva and unknowingly put down her knife and fork. However, she was too embarrassed to continue eating. A gold lobster that cost 100,000 gold made her feel as if she had just eaten a month's worth of her living expenses. However, Fang Xinjian ate with a clear conscience. Right now, he no longer had any use for this small amount of money. Regardless of whether it was the monthly remittance from the prodigious astral divine powers waves, the royalties for the rebirth sword technique within the Empire, or the money for the martial technique's grading plan or the royalties for the rebirth sword technique in the north, he would be able to earn a few million gold every month. This meant that every month, he would be able to buy a few prefectural academies. Each of his actions could affect the entire Great Western region's economy. However, his expenditure was also tremendous. The 8th, 9th, and 10th levels of the mystical prints cost over 1 million gold each. In order to increase the speed at which he condensed specialty seeds, he had to spend a tremendous amount of wealth to purchase heavenly and earthly treasures to help him condense specialty seed. Looking at Anderson, Fang Xinjian said in a relaxed manner, "Don't be so nervous. After all, it's a level 29 ferocious beast. Although it's considered weak amongst the level 29 ferocious beasts, it's normal for it to be expensive. Moreover, the other ingredients are also very valuable. But that's 100,000 gold." Thinking of the few thousand gold he had to spend every month, Anderson felt increasingly upset. A single meal from Fang Xinjian was equivalent to a few years of his earnings. However, Fang Xinjian continued to eat the lobster. At the same time, he sensed streams of aura gradually rising from a specialty seed at the back of his waist. He controlled his heaven's perception to sense it. Countless cells gushed forth, gathering energy according to Fang Xinjian's instructions. He had started to condense specialty seeds. Fang Xinjian said calmly, "The gold lobster isn't just delicious. Although its outer shell can't be compared to the remains of a conferred knight, it can still be made into a level 25 superior divine weapon. After its meat is processed and consumed together with other ingredients, it can stimulate one's internal organs and help me condense a specialty called tenacious physique. It can increase my body's resistance and immunity in various aspects." As they spoke, Fang Xinjian ate the golden lobster in big mouthfuls. The more he ate, the stronger the aura of the specialty seed that had just appeared on his body became. Rhoda and Anderson also sensed that some unknown changes were happening in their bodies. However, they did not have the ability to condense specialty seeds like level 25 conferred knights, and they ate very little as well. They still needed to train for a while before they would be able to bring out the specialty of tenacious physique. Tough physique? If I were to cultivate this specialty on my own, I would need about half a year. But now I can complete half of it in just one meal. Rhoda looked at the burnt golden lobster and sighed in her heart. Wealth and resources are indeed very useful for cultivation. However, if I were to chase after wealth, I wouldn't have enough time to cultivate. Rhoda shook her head, but she still made a decision in her heart. Fang Xinjian is different from me. With his talent, he can do both at the same time. In this aspect, I can't be envious of him. I'll still need to focus on my own so that I'll be able to go further. While Rhoda made up her mind, Anderson looked at the golden lobster on the table and gulped down his saliva. He thought to himself, has Fang Xinjian been eating these things all this while? His talent is only slightly stronger than mine to begin with. If this goes on, won't I never be able to catch up to him? Anderson was stunned for a moment before he continued. I heard that you're going through a martial technique appraisal. Can I go and help? Fang Xinjian threw a glance at him. He knew that Anderson wanted to see for himself if Fang Xinjian was really able to pick up sword techniques at such a fast speed. Fang Xinjian also knew that by letting Anderson take a look, he would be able to ascertain his prestige in the sword arts world. In any case, Fang Xinjian had never thought of hiding it. In fact, with his current abilities, there was no need for him to hide it. At the very least, unless it was a divine-level expert, even if Fang Xinjian could not win against conferred knights who were below the divine level, no one would be able to kill him. Moreover, letting Anderson take a look would also allow him to suppress Fang Xinjian and make him more focused. Rhoda also asked, I'd like to take a look as well. Therefore, Fang Xinjian nodded and said, Wait for me to finish eating these. An hour later, the three of them arrived at the sword tower and entered the room specially arranged for Fang Xinjian. The entire room was made of steel. Anderson looked at the large pieces of steel plates in the corner and frowned slightly. Other than steel plates, there was nothing else in the hall. Anderson asked puzzledly, There's nothing at all? How are you going to rate them like this? If one's speed is fast enough, they'll be able to do everything faster. They'll be able to cultivate faster, and the same goes for research. Fang Xinjian shrugged his shoulders and said, moreover, the rating only assesses the various parameters of the martial technique and then divides the martial technique's level according to the parameters set by the Holy See of Truth. In the end, the thing that consumes the most is the cultivator's time. It's best if they can find someone who has cultivated it before. Otherwise, they'll have to cultivate it themselves. Thankfully, my cultivation speed is very fast. After Fang Xinjian said this, strong gales came raging, and it was as if the entire hall was welcoming a typhoon. Air currents stirred up violently, and Fang Xinjian's entire body seemed to have turned into a faint black line that kept on flashing in all directions. Anderson could hear the incessant sharp whistles, sounds of collisions, and sounds of thunder ringing out in the air. All the sounds were connected and stacked together, making him feel as if he was going to go deaf. This was the situation where Fang Xinjian performed the prodigious demolition sword physique to drown out the air currents and could only step on the air with his feet. Otherwise, the loud sounds would be even more terrifying. If the scene was slowed down by 100 times, one would roughly be able to see that Fang Xinjian was performing sword technique. The speed at which he performed sword techniques was very fast, taking an average of 10 seconds to finish performing a set of sword techniques. After performing the sword techniques, he would go to the steel plates and record down the various parameters of the sword technique. However, his movements were too fast. In Anderson and Rhoda's eyes, they could only see strong gales, a black shadow flashing, and over 100 steel plates flying around in the air. Occasionally, sparks would flash on them, and words would appear in the air one after another. It was only then that they understood why the steel plates were used. It was because with Fang Xinjian's fast speed, the paper would not be able to withstand the force. However, they were still extremely astonished. It was already extremely difficult for someone to be able to reach Fang Xinjian's level of speed. Furthermore, to be able to write while moving at such a fast speed and even be able to test out the various effects of the sword techniques. What kind of control would that require? Fang Xinjian's extraordinary talent, his boundaries negation technique, which allowed him to adapt to high-speed movements, and the prodigious demolition sword physique, which could annihilate the air and reduce air resistance, allowed him to be able to achieve this. If any of the three conditions were lacking, he would not be able to achieve this. An hour later, the strong gales stopped, and over 100 steel plates fell to the ground, releasing loud banging sounds. Densely packed words were written on them. Chapter 4:11. Anderson lifted his head and saw that the entire hall was in a terrible state. The floor, which was made of steel, was filled with cracks and potholes. The center had even caved in into a huge pit, revealing the soil. The entire steel hall looked like a toy that had been trampled on by a child. This was the result of Fang Xinjian trying his best to control his strength and not borrowing it from the ground. Not long after Fang Xinjian stopped, over 10 knights walked in and started to move the steel plate. They would copy down the contents on them into documents and then send them to the Holy See of Truth. Each of them looked at Fang Xinjian with gazes filled with respect, as if they were looking at a god. Anderson's eyes were also filled with astonishment and dejection. He asked, "How many sets of sword techniques have you learned and appraised in 1 hour?" 32 sets. Writing takes too much time, Fang Xinjian said calmly and headed out. Knights started to rush over to repair the place. Anderson looked at Fang Xinjian in disbelief. To learn over 30 sets of sword techniques in 1 hour. Did that not mean that Fang Xinjian would be able to complete the mission given to him by the martial techniques grading plan in just a few days? After Fang Xinjian left the sword tower, he found a place to sit down and started to filter through the sword techniques he had just learned. He deleted the useless ones from their skill seeds, while he synthesized the useful ones into the Zenith Light Sword Formation, Ether Sword Ripples, prodigious demolition sword physique, or the universal truth longsword. According to the standards set by the Holy See of Truth, his universal truth longsword was at B grade, while the other three were at A grade. There was still a lot of room for improvement. It just so happened that 1,000 sets of sword techniques from the Holy See of Truth had been sent over. Fang Xinjian planned to spend a few days to learn them in one go, integrating all 1,000 sets of sword techniques into his own sword techniques, increasing his accumulation of sword arts and his sword arts cultivation. Simultaneously, he was also recovering his demolition sword light, waiting for the sword arts appraisal to continue. As he synthesized the sword technique in his mind, Fang Xinjian glanced at Anderson and Rhoda, who were in front of him. Both of them looked very disappointed, and it was obvious that they had been dealt a blow by Fang Xinjian. Just then, another conferred knight ran over. That conferred knight wore a cold and arrogant expression as he looked at Fang Xinjian and said coldly, "You're Fang Xinjian, right? Young Master Hildebrand would like to invite you over." Fang Xinjian did not even look at the conferred knight who had spoken up and said, "I don't have the time. If there's anything, let him come over himself." Hearing that, the conferred knight's countenance froze, as if he had not expected that Fang Xinjian would not give him any face. He gritted his teeth once again and said in a low voice, "Lord Hildebrand, who is ranked second in the regional academy, has invited you over. Are you really not going?" Fang Xinjian didn't say anything, but Anderson couldn't help but speak up. He had long since disliked Fang Xinjian's arrogant attitude. "I already said there's no time. Are you deaf? Go away quickly." That conferred knight frowned and said, "I've already conveyed the message. If you don't want to go over today, you'll have to do as you see fit." With that, he flung his cloak and stepped out. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared from everyone's field of vision. After this conferred knight left, Rhoda immediately said, "That guy is Peter, the conferred knight ranked 15th in the academy. It's said that he's already at level 25. Of course, he's nothing to you but Hildebrand. It's not a good idea to offend him so directly, right?" Anderson said, "And who is Hildebrand? Why can't we offend him?" "You don't even know who Hildebrand is? Why did you interrupt earlier?" Rhoda looked at Anderson speechlessly. "Who cares who he is? Can he be more amazing than me?" After Anderson said this, he subconsciously threw a glance at Fang Xinjian and sighed. "In this academy, Fang Xinjian is ranked first, and I'm second. The others are just mediocre people." Rhoda smiled bitterly and shook her head. She looked at Fang Xinjian and said, "Xinjian, not only is Hildebrand ranked second in the regional academy, but he's also one of the only 3 students in the academy who are level 29 conferred knights. Moreover, not only is he very strong and talented, but his background is also very impressive. His grandfather was the previous governor of the BI's continent. After he retired, he returned to his hometown in the Great Western region. His father is still a member of the upper echelon in the Central Knight Association. His family's influence in the Great Western region can be said to be deeply rooted. Even Governor Devitt would visit his grandfather every year during festivals. And he himself is the leader of all the underground influences in the Great Western city. Xinjian, if you can avoid offending this person, it's best not to." Fang Xinjian gave it some thought but still shook his head. "I don't have the time." Rhoda smiled bitterly and shook her head. However, she thought to herself, only Xinjian would have such confidence. Thinking of the speed at which Fang Xinjian had learned the sword techniques earlier, she felt a sense of disappointment. She had wanted to catch up to him, but now, the distance between them was increasing. In the next few days, Fang Xinjian learned all 1,000 sets of sword techniques provided by the church in one go and evaluated them one by one. His speed was too fast. Regardless of whether it was learning the sword techniques, evaluating them, or recording them on a steel plate, he was able to complete all of them very quickly. Therefore, 3 days later, Fang Xinjian brought a cart full of evaluation results and headed for the Archbishop's hotel. The representative team from the Holy See of Truth had not even had the time to leave yet. On the other side, the Archbishop and the Knight of the Rising Sun were sitting on chairs at the dining table of the hotel. In front of them was a man with neatly combed hair. He was as strong as a lion and exuded a strong masculine aura from head to toe. He looked like Apollo, the sun god. This man was a top-notch character in the Great Western Region Regional Academy, Hildebrand, who had impeccable talent, abilities, and background. Looking at the Archbishop and the Knight of the Rising Sun, the corners of his lips curled up slightly, revealing a smile that could charm countless young ladies. "Archbishop, Mr. Gardner, this time around I've come with great sincerity. I'll settle the matter with Fang Xinjian." "Are you sure?" The Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardner, looked at Hildebrand and said, "Fang Xinjian doesn't seem to be someone who's easy to negotiate with. It's just a child throwing a tantrum. The scale of the Church's martial techniques grading plan is huge and its influence is far-reaching. It can be said to be an unprecedented plan. For something like this, our country is very worried that your church will only be in contact with one student. Therefore, I hope that our country will be able to establish an official cooperative relationship with your church. Of course, the entire martial techniques grading plan will be led by Fang Xinjian. Moreover, with the support from the Empire's resources, the progress and accuracy of the entire plan will only be higher. Moreover, I've already gotten the approval from the association. The funds for the project will be given out in succession. It'll be equivalent to our country working together with your church to carry out the martial techniques grading plan. With more funds and more people, the speed and efficiency would naturally be higher." The Archbishop nodded slightly. Logically speaking, this was indeed the case. However, Fang Xinjian's talent and looks allowed him to see a different outcome. Therefore, although Hildebrand put forth all sorts of conditions, trying to get into Fang Xinjian's good books and persuasion, the Archbishop only agreed to it on the surface and did not confirm it verbally. Chapter 412. 2 hours later, Hildebrand walked out of the dining hall, frowning slightly. The conferred knight standing next to him was Peter, who had rushed over to inform Fang Xinjian the other day. Peter said, "Elder brother, why would they not agree? It's obvious that our conditions are better. Could it be that there's a problem with Fang Xinjian?" Hildebrand could not figure it out either. However, he merely said, "It's probably a problem with Fang Xinjian. This brat, haha, it seems that I really have to make a trip to meet him personally." "Big brother, you're going to see him personally? Is there a need for it?" Hildebrand said, "Of course there's a use for it. Even if it's just a small part of the martial techniques grading plan, it'll still be worth tens of millions of gold coins. As long as I can take part in this plan, it won't be a problem for me to surpass Austin and Xiao Tianxia within the next half a year. You should be able to fight for the top 3 in the national selection." Austin and Xiao Tianxia were the other 2 level 29 students in the academy. They were ranked 1st and 3rd respectively, and their abilities were close to Hildebrand's. They were also seen as Hildebrand's greatest opponents. To Hildebrand, the martial techniques grading plan was an extremely juicy piece of meat. He had the background of the Knight Association and rich connections. Moreover, the Empire's upper echelon was also very supportive of the collaboration project with the Church. It could be said that everything was prepared. He did not expect himself to be able to swallow up the entire martial techniques grading plan. There were many people in the Central who were eyeing the money that the Church had set down. Just the price of 15 million gold for the first batch of 1,000 sword techniques was enough to make them green with envy. However, even if Hildebrand were to get a small piece of it, he would be able to manage millions of funds. In his opinion, with his background, it would be easy for him to intercept hundreds of thousands. As for the rest of the money, he would use it to purchase various cultivation resources and heavenly materials and earthly treasures on himself. Speaking of it, it was also to speed up the progress of the project. I'm afraid that Fang Xinjian is not willing. The last time I saw him, he was very emotional. Hildebrand shook his head and smiled. So what if I'm unwilling? Collaborating with the Vatican was the trend of the times, and all the big shots in the central government were very supportive of this collaboration. This was a national policy, so what if he was talented? Moreover, no one could monopolize everything in this world. Fang Xinjian had sold the prodigious astral divine powers waves to the second prince out of luck. However, he had already incurred the jealousy of many people. If he was smart, he would have given away half of the martial technique's grading plan. It was not a resource that he could monopolize. If he really wanted to hog it all for himself, he would only be stuffed to death. Hildebrand shook his head and sighed. A man who is never content is like a snake trying to swallow an elephant. If a person wanted to eat alone every time, he would not be able to live. Humans were social animals. If they wanted long-term benefits, they needed to share the benefit. Fang Xinjian wants to give everything to himself. That's the stupidest way to die. On the side, Peter nodded repeatedly, a thoughtful look on his face. Hildebrand gave it some thought and said, "Make another trip to the Central. Go back and ask the butler to transfer 10,000 gold." 10,000 again? Pete smiled bitterly. Isn't it too much to give them? This time around, in order to speed up the progress of the collaboration project, Hildebrand had already given over 80,000 gold to the officials in the central government. He could be said to have put in a lot of effort. One had to know that his own cash flow was only slightly more than 1,000,000 yuan. If you want to get something, you'll have to pay first. Many people won't be able to get their hands on the money from the collaboration project, so they won't be proactive. By giving them money, we'll be letting them gain a share as well. Otherwise, even if my father is the Knight Association's deputy chief, they won't let the plan pass so easily if I were to monopolize the profit. Hildebrand patted Pete on the shoulder and said, "All right, go in a while. You'll only be able to earn big money if you're willing to part with a small amount of money. 80,000 gold in exchange for several million or 10 million gold. There's nothing more worthwhile than this." Pete sighed and said, "We're the ones who do all the tiring and dirty work. Those people in the central government, on the other hand, are able to earn money while lying down." Hildebrand said, "They have their own difficulties. Living under His Majesty's nose isn't that easy either. Moreover, even if we don't need these favors this time around, there will come a time when we'll need them in the future. I'll be heading to the imperial capital sooner or later. You can be considered to be making preparations for me." Pete looked at him and nodded fiercely. "Brother, you'll definitely be able to get into the top 3 in the national selection this time around. No, you'll be able to get first place." Hildebrand smiled. "Let's first defeat Odysseus and Xiao Tianxia and become the number 1 in the Great Western region." Just as the two of them were talking, they saw Fang Xinjian walking toward them. Pete frowned, stood before Fang Xinjian, and said, "Fang Xinjian, what are you doing here?" Fang Xinjian threw him a glance. "It's none of your business." Fury flashed in Pete's eyes. However, he had heard that Fang Xinjian had single-handedly gotten rid of 2 level 27 assassins from the Sand Country. He also knew that Fang Xinjian had single-handedly suppressed Gao clan in the Bi's region. Gao clan's clan head was a level 27 conferred knight. Therefore, although he was furious, he did not make a move. It was because he knew that Hildebrand was standing behind him. Hildebrand said, "All right, Pete. Don't quarrel with a child." After saying that, he walked up to Fang Xinjian. Looking at his young face, Hildebrand shook his head and said, "Fang Xinjian, you're really stupid. If I were you, I definitely wouldn't make so many enemies for no reason. Right now, you're relying on your talent to do whatever you want. However, you don't know that I can't see any of the qualities that a successful person should have. Fang Xinjian looked at Hildebrand and asked, "Who are you?" Hildebrand smiled, and Pete could not help but say, "This is young Master Hildebrand, the second strongest expert in the regional academy. You'd better show some respect." Hildebrand said calmly, "The association has already made a decision regarding the martial techniques grading plan. I'll be taking over and carrying out the in-depth cooperation between the Empire and the Church. I'll send someone to the Sword Tower to get the detailed information regarding the Church in the afternoon. I hope that you'll be more cooperative." "You've sent someone to the Sword Tower?" Hildebrand frowned and shook his head. Fang Xinjian smiled, knowing that Fang Xinjian did not know that he had already completed the grading of 1,000 sets of sword technique. Of course, Fang Xinjian would not have expected that Fang Xinjian would be able to complete it so quickly. Therefore, Fang Xinjian could not be bothered with the two of them. He threw them a glance and continued to head for the Archbishop's room. Hildebrand looked at Fang Xinjian's back and shook his head, saying, "As your senior, there's something that I have to say to you. Fang Xinjian, if you don't even know how to be a human, how are you going to reach the pinnacle of knights? How should I put it? There's a saying in the Westerners that is right. Things that are too rigid are easy to break. This is your current state. You're young, I understand. You think that you're omnipotent, but it's just a misconception. You're unable to see the general situation clearly. The entire world is formed by countless trends. If you wish to reach the pinnacle, you'll have to go along with the world's trends. This time around, the cooperation between the Empire and the Church is the same. You'd better take a good look at the situation. Don't create trouble and spoil things." With that, he left without waiting for Fang Xinjian's reply. Chapter 413. Through his heaven's perception, Hildebrand frowned slightly when he saw that Fang Xinjian had left without any reaction. Doesn't care? Is he confident? Or is he a fool? Peter followed behind Hildebrand and said, "Sir, do you think that he will really create trouble?" Hildebrand seemed to be in control of the entire situation as he said calmly, "Not necessarily. However, young people tend to be impulsive and easily angered. This is especially so for a genius like him. He thinks too highly of himself, so it's normal for something to happen. Today I've said a few words to him. It can be considered as me doing my part as a senior." He then smiled. "Since he's here, he's naturally here to look for the Archbishop. I'll wait for you at the bar counter outside. Go and find out about the situation. If he really acts recklessly, then don't blame me for not holding back." The moment he saw the Archbishop and the Knight of the Rising Sun, Fang Xinjian said directly, "I'm done." "What?" The Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardner, asked puzzledly, "What's done?" "I've assessed all 1,000 sets of sword technique." Fang Xinjian rubbed his forehead. Right now there were still countless sword techniques information circulating in his mind. After handing over the documents, he planned on going into seclusion for a few days to integrate all the information and completely solidify them into his own sword technique. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, the Knight of the Rising Sun appeared displeased and said, "Fang Xinjian, don't spout nonsense. This joke isn't funny." Peter, who had used his heaven's perception to scan through the gaps of the door, also smiled coldly. Hearing what Fang Xinjian had said, he felt that Fang Xinjian must be a fool. However, Fang Xinjian looked straight at the Archbishop and Gardner and said, "I don't joke around like this. Since I've completed it, I've completed it. I've brought all the assessment information over today." Gardner frowned as he looked at Fang Xinjian as if he was looking at a lunatic. "That's 1,000 sets of sword techniques. Even if you're a fast learner, do you know how much time you'll need to spend to go through all the various assessments?" Gardner said, "Fang Xinjian, I know that you're a fast learner. However, this speed and research speed are two different things. No matter how fast you are, can you be this fast during reviews and writing? When you are testing a sword technique's temperature, explosive effect, the power of light rays, and the transmission of power, you can still be so fast. You can run at the fastest speed, but during the review process, when you move your fingers, even when you make small movements, they can run as fast as you? Gardner pointed out the crux of the problem. Even if knights who specialized in high speed could sprint and perform killing techniques at high speed, it did not mean that they would be able to write, eat, drink, read, or do various other things at the highest speed. This was impossible. Without Fang Xinjian's talent, without his boundaries negation, which allowed him to ignore the other conditions and reach his highest speed, and without the prodigious demolition sword physique which could annihilate the air, it would be impossible. Therefore, Fang Xinjian nodded. Gardner smiled helplessly and said, "You're really good at bragging." Just then, the archbishop behind him stopped Gardner from continuing. He looked at Fang Xinjian and said, "You said that you brought the review materials. Where are they?" "They're outside." Fang Xinjian tilted his head and said, "But if I were to give you all 1,000 sets at once, you guys would also be able to give me 15 million gold in one go, right?" "Of course." The archbishop stood up and said with a smile, "Then let's go take a look." Gardner frowned as he looked at Fang Xinjian's face, feeling very surprised and doubtful. Could it be that he has really completed it? But how did he do it? Hildebrand sat at the bar counter, drinking alone. In just over 10 minutes, he had already rejected the invitations from 3 beauties. As the eldest son of the empire's aristocrats, Hildebrand had been living a life that was completely different from ordinary people ever since he was born. Martial arts, politics, business, arts, interests, and so on. He was able to pick up all of them easily. When he was 15 years old, his father had already dismissed all of his tutors and personally taught him the path of a knight. 7 years later, he participated in the regional selection and won first place, becoming the representative of the Great Western region's younger generation. 8 years later, he became a level 29 conferred knight. It was then that he understood the meaning of his life even more clearly. Wealth, power, status, and fame. He had already enjoyed all of them. He also realized that he did not have much interest in these things. To him, they were just means to achieve his goals. Only martial arts itself was worth him devoting his entire life to studying. To become a divine-level expert. It was unknown when it started, but this thought had filled up Hildebrand's mind, becoming the goal that he pursued crazily. He had spent over 18 hours of hard work training every day, had access to all sorts of heavenly and earthly treasures, ferocious beasts, and had received meticulous guidance from his father and even his grandfather, the previous governor of the Bi's continent. His abilities had improved by leaps and bounds, but it had also allowed him to understand some things. Although his talent was already strong enough, and he was already a genius amongst geniuses, there was no lack of geniuses on the path of martial arts. Which of those who were able to become knights were not geniuses amongst geniuses? Which of those who were able to become conferred knights were not geniuses amongst geniuses? However, there were differences in geniuses as well. In the past, those who had been able to become divine-level experts all possessed various conditions that would cause ordinary people to feel despair. Therefore, Hildebrand understood that with his talent, it would be impossible for him to become a divine-level expert by working behind closed doors. Although this was a depressing outcome, it also allowed Hildebrand to find a new direction for him to take. Since he could not rely on his own talent, then he could only gather resources. Be it money, divine equipment, or the legacies of divine-level experts. As long as it was something that could help him become a divine-level expert, he would gather them all. Gathering resources, seizing resources. As long as he could become a divine-level expert, everything would be good. Therefore, this time around, when he came across the juicy meat of the martial techniques grading plan, Hildebrand immediately took action. He drank another cup of wine and kept on going through the contents of the entire plan in his mind, secretly checking if there were any areas that he had missed out on. Just then, another beautiful lady with fiery red short hair, who was wearing a gown, walked over while swaying her hips like a little demoness. Hildebrand said out of habit, "I'm sorry, I'm waiting for someone." "Isn't the person you're waiting for me?" The little red-haired demoness smiled, her red lips exuding an astonishing charm. Looking at Hildebrand, who was in a daze, the little red-haired demoness said, "I'm Maria, a reporter from the Central Times." Hildebrand nodded. When the second prince had just brought out the Central Times, Hildebrand had already clearly seen through its value. Therefore, in order to exert pressure on Fang Xinjian through public opinion, Hildebrand had even invited a reporter over. However, he had not expected that the other party would be so well informed that they would be able to find their way here. Chapter 4:14. Hildebrand smiled and said, "Our appointment is tomorrow morning, right?" Maria replied with a smile, "I'm a rather impatient person. I'll report as soon as I can. Time is money." Seeing Hildebrand nod, Maria took out a pen and paper. As she took notes, she asked, "Speaking of which, I haven't been able to fully understand this martial techniques grading plan. What is the meaning of this plan?" Hildebrand said, "The martial techniques grading plan is to collect and organize all the martial techniques in the world." "What are the benefits?" "There are too many benefits. The detailed parameters of each martial technique will be tested out, and the growth curve of each martial technique will also be gradually understood. If an ordinary knight were to cultivate a set of martial technique, he would usually need several years or even over 10 years to reach perfection. What if this set of martial technique does not meet his expectations? The martial techniques grading plan is to let everyone know what they are cultivating, how to cultivate it best, and how they will end up. It's the same for the research of martial techniques. Nowadays, the synthesis formulas and innovative research often require information on all sorts of martial technique. These information are all from the academy, and most of the time, the researchers have to cultivate it themselves. It's time-consuming and laborious, and there are too many repetitive studies. Once the martial techniques grading plan is completed, all the researchers will be able to get the information on the martial techniques they want. This will not only benefit our generation, but the future of the entire world. This is a foundation-building plan. After all the martial techniques are categorized and tested, it will be convenient for everyone in the world, be it in terms of cultivation or research on martial technique. Once the martial techniques grading plan is successful, the speed of research on martial techniques in the world will increase by more than 10 times. It's said that the Church had not planned on working together with the Empire for this plan. It was only because the Great Western Region's genius, Fang Xinjian, received the Holy Orizin's recommendation that the plan was successful. Is that so? That's true, Hildebrand said. There's no doubt about Fang Xinjian's talent. However, such a large-scale plan isn't something that can be done by one person, nor is it something that he can complete alone. That's why the country's support is needed. Otherwise, how long will it take for him to complete the plan alone? Moreover, talent is very important in the plan, but a deep level of sword arts cultivation, rich experience, and understanding of sword arts are also very important. The central government will send many masters to assist in this project. Just then, Peter, who had been sent out, returned. Hildebrand threw him a glance, and the two of them started to communicate through information currents. Hildebrand asked, "How is it? What did they say?" Peter frowned and said, "Fang Xinjian said he completed the evaluation of 1,000 sets of sword techniques." Hildebrand shook his head. "How is that possible? I thought he had a way. Isn't this just a child acting shamelessly?" But he said he brought all the information and was about to show the Archbishop and the Knight of the Rising Sun. Hildebrand frowned. Could it be that he has completed part of it? Or is it forged? Shaking his head, Hildebrand was still unsure of what Feng Xinjian was up to. Therefore, he stood up and said, "Let's go. Let's go take a look and see what on earth Feng Xinjian is up to." Maria, the female reporter, said in surprise, "Feng Xinjian is here too? Has something happened?" Therefore, under Hildebrand's instructions, Peter told the female reporter the entire matter. When Maria heard that all 1,000 sets of sword techniques had been completed, her beautiful eyes widened. However, she immediately realized that this was a big piece of news. She looked at Hildebrand excitedly and asked, "Is this possible?" "Nonsense." Hildebrand sighed and said, "It could be that Xinjian is a little dissatisfied with the cooperation between the Empire and the Church. He was originally in charge of the project, but now, he has to share the profits with many people. After all, he's still too young and impetuous. He might not be able to accept this." The female reporter's eyes gleamed. The fight between the geniuses and the members of the upper echelon was another big topic. She asked, "Are you trying to say that Feng Xinjian wants to lead the entire project independently? He's young, so it's only natural for him to be more arrogant." The female reporter asked again, "But when I came here, I heard that Feng Xinjian only spent a few minutes to learn the universal truth longsword. Is this true? If it's true, then he would only need a few thousand minutes to learn all 1,000 sets of sword techniques, right? It seems that it's not impossible for him to finish it within a few days. Moreover, he created the rebirth sword technique previously, and it's said that he received praise from Lord Holy Orizon." "Haha, you're taking it for granted. First of all, creating a sword technique and learning a sword technique at a speed are two different things. 50 years ago, the Blood Knight created a set of Blood Sea Divine Spear and was unrivaled in the southern borders. However, as he was a slow learner when he was young, he was thought to be useless. The rebirth sword technique is very powerful, but it's just a nurturing technique. It only shows that Feng Xinjian is very experienced in physical cultivation and the circulation of vital energy and blood. It doesn't have much to do with his sword arts cultivation." Hildebrand explained. Moreover, he picked up the universal truth longsword very quickly. However, just because he picked up one set of sword technique quickly doesn't mean that he'll be able to pick up all sword techniques quickly. Each set of sword technique has different characteristics, directions, and is suitable for different people. The fact that Feng Xinjian picked up the universal truth longsword very quickly means that he has accumulated experience in the same area. If he were to switch to another set of sword technique, he might not be able to learn it no matter what. Moreover, learning a new sword technique requires a high level of concentration. He can focus for a few minutes or even a few hours, but he can't possibly focus for several tens of hours, right? Secondly, the martial technique's grading plan doesn't just require him to pick up the technique. He also needs to test and record them one by one. Let's not talk about the various indicators of the test, just record it. No matter how fast your actions are, can your writing speed be fast? Writing and recording. These are all actions that require extremely precise control. No matter how fast a person is, they won't be able to be very fast in this area. Even if he were to copy all the information from 1,000 sets of sword techniques, it would probably take him half a month. How could he possibly finish it now? Maria nodded, feeling that Hildebrand's analysis was logical and logical. She recorded down everything that he said. She felt even more excited. As expected, anything related to Feng Xinjian was big news. Previously, the rebirth sword technique had already attracted the attention of divine-level experts. To think that this time around, Hildebrand and Feng Xinjian would be pitted against each other as well. Along the way, Hildebrand still did not think that Feng Xinjian had really completed the evaluation of 1,000 sets of sword technique. In the end, the only people Fang Xinjian can rely on for this matter are Governor Devitt and the Second Prince's faction. However, the cooperation between the Empire and the Church isn't something that the Great Western region alone can decide. It will definitely attract the attention of the central government. In the central government, the First Prince's words carry more weight. Even if Fang Xinjian were to bring out Devitt and I were to make use of the First Prince's strength, he still wouldn't be able to win against me. After giving it much thought, Hildebrand felt that it was impossible for Fang Xinjian to forge the materials. However, it was an extremely common method for Fang Xinjian to create some first and then say that he was still sorting out the remaining materials to stall for time. With that, Hildebrand became even more curious about what Fang Xinjian would do if he were to expose him. He's still inexperienced. He's already met me at the entrance. Haven't he thought about what I'm here for? Therefore, Hildebrand, Peter, and the female reporter walked out of the hotel and saw the Archbishop and the Knight of the Rising Sun standing before a cart of documents. The two of them were clearly using their heaven's perception to check the contents of the documents. Hildebrand walked over, only to discover that Fang Xinjian was no longer around. Looking at the cart filled with documents, he smiled and thought, could it be that he was rejected by the Archbishop on the spot? After giving it some thought, Hildebrand felt that it was not impossible. To the Church, it would be better to cooperate with the entire empire than with a student like Fang Xinjian. At the end of the day, Fang Xinjian is just a student. Before he becomes a top-notch level 29 expert and becomes an overlord, turning his talent into his abilities, he's just a student. Chapter 4:15. As Hildebrand thought about this, he turned to look at the Archbishop and the Knight of the Rising Sun, greeting them. Hello, I wonder how the two of you are doing with regards to the collaboration with our country? The Archbishop did not say a word, and neither did the Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardner. He merely opened his mouth and then looked at Hildebrand with a strange gaze. Take a look at the contents of the documents this time around. Hildebrand felt that Gardner was looking at him a little strangely. He turned to look at the documents in the cart, and at the next moment, he activated his heaven's perception and started scanning the contents of the documents. Sword of Blood. Blood's temperature of scorching blood. Curve from level 1 to 20. Many detailed parameters were displayed before Hildebrand. Even though he had never cultivated the Sword of Blood before, he was still able to clearly understand the characteristics and information of the entire sword technique. However, he soon scanned through this sword technique, then the next one, and the next one. As a level 29 expert, Hildebrand's ether synchronization rate was naturally at 100%. Therefore, the process of scanning through the books was very fast. However, the more he scanned, the more his countenance turned grim. It was because even though he had been reading up till now, he could not find any flaws. At the very least, all the information regarding the sword techniques seemed to have no problems. It's impossible. How is this possible? He completed the evaluation of 1,000 sets of sword techniques in just a few days? As he thought about this, a hint of astonishment suddenly appeared on Hildebrand's face. If this was true, then it would mean that Fang Xinjian had already learned 1,000 sets of sword technique. Even if he had only succeeded in synthesizing half of them, how powerful would Fang Xinjian's killing technique be? Moreover, if Fang Xinjian's talent was really that heaven-defying, then how astonishing would the growth of his sword arts be? Or how many sets of sword techniques had he already learned? The Great Western Region Regional Academy had quite a number of books. This was the first time Hildebrand felt a little terrified after learning about a person's talent. It was because he had never known that a person's talent could be so terrifying. The female reporter Maria asked, "What's wrong? Are these the sword techniques information written by Fang Xinjian? There are so many. Is it really a full 1,000 sets?" The corners of Hildebrand's lips curled up into a bitter smile. Yes, a total of 1,000 sets. The female reporter asked innocently once again. That Fang Xinjian completed the evaluation of 1,000 sets of sword techniques? Hildebrand only felt that his face was burning up. Thinking of what he had said to the female reporter earlier, he felt as if he had been slapped. On the other side, the Archbishop revealed a satisfied smile, patted Gardner's shoulder, and left immediately. The Knight of the Rising Sun, Gardner, also had a grim expression. No one could have imagined that there would be such a terrifying talent like Fang Xinjian in this world. In just a few days, he had not only learned 1,000 sets of sword arts, he had even tested all of them. Is this even a human? Gardner was at a loss. The female reporter asked, "Are these records real?" Hildebrand smiled bitterly and said, "The numerical value doesn't seem to be a problem." The female reporter continued to ask, "Then does that mean that Fang Xinjian completed the cultivation and evaluation of 1,000 sets of sword techniques within 3 or 4 days?" Hildebrand fell silent for a moment before he forced himself to nod. This possibility can't be ruled out. But as for the specifics, we'll still need to check it up further. Maria recorded it down excitedly. This was a great piece of news. To be able to complete 1,000 sets of sword techniques within just a few days. This was something that had never happened before and would never be able to do in the future. Hildebrand suddenly thought of what he had said to Fang Xinjian earlier. With this talent, what sort of logic, what sort of rules are there to abide by? When one is too rigid, one will break easily. But if one is a divine-level weapon, how can one break it? Is this what gives you the right to be arrogant, Fang Xinjian? His smile turned increasingly grim. Hildebrand, what a joke. When you said those words, they were probably just a joke in the eyes of others. At the next moment, he looked toward Peter and said through information currents, "Invite Fang Xinjian to the next auction. Remember, you must have a good attitude." "Oh right. Tinan will be back soon, right?" "Yes, he will be back soon." Ignoring Peter, who had a twisted expression, Hildebrand thought to himself, 1,000 sets of sword techniques, 1,000 sets of sword techniques. The more Hildebrand thought about it, the more he could sense the heavy aura. That was a total of 1,000 sets of sword technique. Hildebrand let out a deep breath. Fang Xinjian must not be taken as an enemy head-on. However, if I were to use him to clear away obstacles, it would be better than the sharpest blade in the world. At the thought of this, Hildebrand once again revealed a confident and calm expression. In the Empire's imperial capital, the news agency that the second prince had set up. Due to the increasing influence of the newspaper, the entire news agency now occupied a 5-story building, and there was an endless stream of people coming and going. Charlie walked slowly into the hall, still wearing a gloomy expression. It had been smooth sailing for him to become a conferred knight at a young age. He had even received the first prince's guidance and joined the Knight Association, with a bright future ahead of him. However, due to the interrogation of Fang Xinjian in the Great Western region, he had stirred up a lot of trouble. In the end, he had gone through a lot of trouble to negotiate with various parties and had even given Fang Xinjian his unique effulgence weapon. It was only then that his name was cleared and he did not have to be chased to the southern borders. Despite this, he was still ostracized and suppressed after he returned to the imperial capital. He was already marginalized in the association. Just then, a middle-aged man said, "Charlie, you're here." Charlie nodded. "Thank you, Diak. If I don't find something to do, I'll start rusting. Old friends are still talking about these. Let's go, there are many people waiting." Charlie followed the other party into the office, only to discover that there were already 5 other second transition experts waiting for him there. "This is the Fireworks Academy's Zack. This is the Shatter Steel Academy's Barduo. This is..." The middle-aged man, Diak, pointed to Charlie and said, This is the Night Association's representative, Charlie. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Charlie greeted these second transition teachers from the aristocratic academies politely. These people had no hope of progressing in their martial arts, and had thus chosen to become teachers in the various aristocratic academies, hoping to gain riches. In the past, Fang Xinjian would not have paid any attention to these people. After everyone finished greeting each other, the middle-aged man, Diak, said, "The main reason I've invited everyone here is because there's a report that we need to verify." With that, stacks of information were distributed to everyone. Charlie took a look and discovered that they were all information on sword arts, but they were all sword arts that he was familiar with. He continued reading and discovered that the growth curve of sword arts, the various changes at each level, and the parameters were recorded in great detail. It could be said to be textbook material. Chapter 4:16. Charlie raised his brows and asked this. Could it be that this is the information on the Holy See of Truth's martial techniques grading plan? The others also lifted their heads and voiced their doubt. It was because they realized that the sword techniques recorded were the sword techniques that made their academy famous. Right now, the various indicators of the sword techniques had been compiled into detailed information. Although there was no specific cultivation method recorded on it, just the densely packed data alone was enough to make them tremble with fear. This is indeed the information on the martial techniques grading plan. However, the more detailed parts are confidential, so I'm sorry that I can't tell you guys. The main reason I've invited everyone here today is to ask if there are any problems with this information and if there are any mistakes. The entire office gradually fell silent. Everyone looked at the information in their hands and compared it with what they knew. Over half an hour later, a bald old man sighed and said, "The church really lives up to its reputation as the #1 influence in the world. These sword techniques are clearly taught by our academy, but in the end, their information is even more detailed than ours." Someone else shouted, "It's not just detailed. They've tested many directions that we haven't even thought of. After looking at this information, I feel that my sword techniques have been wasted. The church is really amazing. I think their research on martial techniques is at least 20 years ahead of ours." Charlie frowned as he looked at the information. However, in his mind, he vaguely agreed with what the others had said. This information was far too detailed. Even he himself would probably find it hard to come up with all the data. It truly showed the strength of the Holy See of Truth. Just then, another short guy smiled and said, "Everyone, you're wrong about this. If I'm not wrong, this thing was probably created by our country's conferred knights, right? How is that possible? Could it be that the Empire is also planning a martial techniques grading plan? Wouldn't it be a waste of resources for our country to do this? Brother Charlie, you're from the association. Do you have any news about this?" Charlie was stunned for a moment. Right now, he was just a person who was not involved in this, so how could he possibly know about the core information? He could only say, "I've heard of similar rumors. It seems that they're going to work together with the church, but I don't know the details." The short guy grinned and said, "If it wasn't because my brother is in the great western city, I wouldn't know about this either. Let me ask first, do you know Fang Xinjian?" "Who doesn't know Fang Xinjian? The one who invented the rebirth sword technique, right? The rebirth sword technique is too hard to cultivate. The students in our academy have yet to master it. But it's indeed good stuff. Our headmaster has trained it to the 3rd level, and it's almost the same as his daily potential. Yes, this Fang Xinjian is truly talented. Oh, I think I heard that Lord Holy Orizon recommended him to participate in the martial techniques grading plan. Didn't the delegation come to the imperial capital some time ago to summon Fang Xinjian? This Fang Xinjian is also a young and hot-blooded person. I heard that he rejected it directly, and then the representative group went to the great western city. That's because he's awesome. He's made our empire proud. Hearing everyone's words, Charlie frowned slightly, feeling increasingly displeased. He thought to himself, Fang Xinjian, you can be complacent for a few years first. While you're focusing on creating your own martial techniques and on the martial techniques grading plan, I'm improving at every moment. One day, I'll make you pay me back 100-fold. Hearing everyone's words, the short guy said, Don't go off topic. Let me tell you guys, the information that you're looking at now should have been written by Fang Xinjian. How is that possible? It's only been a short while, and he's already appraised over 10 sets of sword techniques. The short guy's expression became increasingly smug as he said, You guys don't understand. Fang Xinjian is a true genius. It's not just over 10 sets of sword technique. He appraised all 1,000 sets of sword techniques that the church had ordered, and he received several tens of millions on the spot. What kind of joke is this? He's bragging. Even a divine-level expert wouldn't be able to learn 1,000 sets of sword techniques in one go. The short guy looked at the noisy crowd with disdain and said, My brother saw it with his own eyes. How can it be fake? I'm telling you guys, I didn't believe it in the beginning either. However, the news has already spread like wildfire throughout the entire Great Western City. He then looked at Diak from the newspaper firm and said, The reason why you've invited us over to verify the information is to confirm the news, right? Seeing that everyone's gazes had turned toward him, Diak from the newspaper firm said helplessly, It's true that the information that you're looking at was obtained from the Great Western Region Regional Academy's Sword Arts team. However, I can't say who wrote it. A copy of the appraisal information written by Fang Xinjian was naturally kept in the academy. After all, the Holy See of Truth's martial techniques grading plan was meant to raise the standards of martial techniques research across the world, and there was no requirement to keep it a secret. This was why it had been sent to the central government and was being studied by countless members of the upper echelon. Although Diak from the newspaper firm did not say it explicitly, the meaning behind his words was already very clear. Diak looked at the astonished crowd who were whispering to each other and continued, This news is still top secret at the moment. Everyone, please pay attention to the confidentiality clause. Yes. We definitely won't leak out the news. But it's just 1,000 sets. It's true that there will always be talented people in every generation. This Fang Xinjian is amazing. He'll probably become another divine-level expert in a few years' time. Hearing everyone's exclamations, Charlie's brows furrowed even tighter. He let out a cold snort, flicked his sleeves and left, causing everyone to be extremely astonished. However, only Charlie himself understood that right now, he was feeling extremely bitter. I'll probably never be able to surpass Fang Xinjian in this lifetime. 10 days later, in the Chax region, which was 150 kilometers to the north of the Great Western City. The entire sky was dark, and faint purple lightning encompassed it, casting a shadow over everyone's hearts. Ferdinand, who was at the very front of the group, looked at the mountain peak in the distance and said, Xinjian should be there now. Next to Ferdinand was a warrior who was dressed in white clothes and armor. He belonged to the Holy See of Truth and was even one of the Archbishop's guards. His name was Jiawei. Jiawei looked at the volcano that was surrounded by smoke and continued to surge up into the sky. He asked, This volcano is going to erupt soon, right? That's right. Xinjian said that he's looking for a volcano like this to test out his sword art. Looking for a volcano to test out his sword arts. Jiawei was stunned for a moment before he nodded in understanding. So that's how it is. He has a sword technique that he needs to borrow the power of the flames in the Earth's core to cultivate, right? However, this volcano looks very ferocious. Once it erupts, the area within a range of 100 lis will probably be in a mess. Isn't that a little too dangerous? Ferdinand smiled. One can't possibly be afraid of danger in the cultivation of martial arts, right? The group slowly headed up the mountain. However, as they moved, the ground under their feet kept on trembling. There were also large areas of flames coming from the direction of the volcano's crater. A pungent smell of sulfur came gushing over, and the air around them became increasingly hot. Chapter 4:17. After another small-scale earthquake, Jiawei said, "It's too dangerous. With a volcano eruption like this, we can't let the large group proceed any further." Ferdinand said, "But Lord Xinjiang is inside. He has to sign the authorization for the rebirth sword technique today. Let me go with him." A white-armored warrior in his 20s stepped out and said, "Captain, I cultivate the earthly flame's divine sword. I've been cultivating in the volcano since I was 10 years old." The young warrior smiled and looked at Jiawei, saying, "Here, my abilities are twice as strong as usual. Moreover, I should be the strongest in the team in terms of surviving in a volcanic environment." Jiawei frowned. Looking at the volcano erupting with increasing frequency, as well as the sky filled with volcanic ash, he nodded and said, "Ferdinand, let Ben bring you there." The young man known as Ben was also a genius second transition conferred knight with a cultivation of level 24. His experience of cultivating in volcanoes since young allowed him to be like a fish in water. Ben grabbed Ferdinand and sprinted towards the peak of the volcano. Along the way, lava started to flow on the mountain rocks, and the ground under their feet gradually became like a hot metal plate. Occasionally, large pieces of rocks would be shot out from the direction of the volcano's crater. Despite this, Ben's speed was still very fast. It was true that he was very familiar with this environment. Bringing Ferdinand along, they avoided countless dangers, and in the blink of an eye, they were already close to the volcano's crater. Ben pointed to the figure above the volcano's crater and said, "Is that Fang Xinjiang?" Ferdinand nodded. "It's him." At the next moment, he shouted, "Xinjiang." In midair, Fang Xinjiang had been looking at the volcano's crater under his feet. When he heard Ferdinand's shout, he turned to look. At the next moment, soaring flames came pouncing toward him. Under Ferdinand's and Ben's astonished gazes, the volcano erupted. Lava and rocks soared up into the sky, engulfing everything. The entire world once again fell into darkness in that instant. Terrifying explosions rang out incessantly, reverberating to and fro in the atmosphere, almost deafening Ferdinand's ears. "No!" Ferdinand let out an astonished cry and was about to dash up when Ben grabbed him back. "Are you crazy? If we go up there, we'll just die." At the same time, Ben unsheathed his long sword and activated the earthly flame's divine sword. It was only then that Ferdinand could see the situation around him clearly. The ground under his feet kept on cracking, and lava kept on spurting out from all directions. The sword in Ben's hand continued to swing, and the sword transformed into lava, colliding with the surrounding lava. It was as if the entire world had turned into a sea of fire. Ben activated the earthly flame's divine sword at full power to fight against the surrounding lava. At the same time, he grabbed Ferdinand and dashed down the mountain. However, the power of this volcano's eruption was far beyond his imagination. The lava that filled the sky rushed over like a tsunami. There were raging flames below his feet, above his head, all around him. In just a few seconds, hundreds of thousands of tons of material had been ejected from the crater. Even if only a small part of it was blocked, it was still not something that could be done. The earthly flame's long sword in his hand clashed against the overwhelming waves of fire. With a loud rumble, Ben spurted out a mouthful of blood and flew out, grabbing onto Ferdinand. Seeing that the two of them were about to fall into the sea of fire, a hint of despair appeared in both Ben's and Ferdinand's eyes. However, at the next moment, a violent gush of cold air came gushing out. With the crater as the center, an extremely low temperature of -200 degrees Celsius gushed out. It was as if someone had scattered several million tons of liquid nitrogen at one go, and all the lava was instantly frozen. All the lava, volcanic ashes, rocks, and everything else was sealed in ice, lying there quietly. It was as if the entire world had suddenly gone from a fiery hell to Antarctica. No, it was even colder than Antarctica. Ferdinand let out a light breath, and felt as if the air and his lungs were about to freeze up. However, they did not have the time to care about this. Instead, they opened their eyes wide and looked at the scene before them in astonishment. Tap 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 sounds rang out, and under their astonished gazes, Fang Xinjian walked over slowly, stepping on the ice. Wherever he passed by, there would be kacha-kacha sounds in the air. It was as if everything before him had frozen up. Within 10 days, Fang Xinjian had finally melted all 1,000 sets of sword techniques together, synthesizing them into his Zenith Light Sword Formation, Ether Sword Ripples, Prodigious Demolition Sword Physique, and Universal Truth Longsword. His current level of swordsmanship had reached the pinnacle of perfection. Fang Xinjian threw a glance at the two of them and said, "The two of you can head down first." He looked at the layer of ice under his feet. This little bit of temperature won't be able to stop him. Ben nodded, pulled Ferdinand, and ran off. Ferdinand shouted, "Xinjian, aren't you going down together with us?" Fang Xinjian had already turned back. Looking at the layer of ice under his feet that was trembling continuously, he sent out over 1,000 streams of ether sword ripples with a single thought. The ether sword ripples were divided into 3 forms. The initial form, high temperature and low temperature. Now that Fang Xinjian's sword arts had improved tremendously, the prowess of the ether sword ripples had also increased tremendously. Wherever the 1,000 streams of ether sword ripples passed by, the air would freeze up. It was as if everything in the world was going to be sealed in ice for eternity. The layer of ice under their feet had been reinforced once again, resisting the pressure coming from the depths of the earth. As the entire volcano had been frozen, Ben and Ferdinand had no obstructions along the way. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at the foot of the mountain. They then ran a distance of over 10 kilometers in one go and met up with Jiawei. Jiawei asked, "What's going on?" Ben turned back abruptly and discovered that there were flames coming from the direction of the mountain once again. The tremors of the earth under their feet had also become increasingly abnormal. This is bad. With him blocking it like this, the eruption will only be even more intense. The prowess will be over 10 times stronger than before. Ben had been cultivating in volcanic areas all year round. Therefore, he knew very well what kind of power was contained in a volcano's eruption. That was a violent power that was squeezed out from the depths of the earth. It was a terrifying violence that could destroy an entire city, an astonishing power that could cause the eruption of several million or even 10 million tons of substances. Furthermore, Fang Xinjian had sealed the entire volcano in ice, causing the pressure in the volcano to keep on increasing. Under the layers of compression, the pressure in the volcano had reached an extreme point. It was like a pressure cooker that had exceeded its limits and would explode at any moment. The power produced would far surpass that of an ordinary volcano's eruption. Hearing Ben's explanation, Ferdinand said anxiously, "But Xinjian is still inside." Jiawei frowned and said, "He can only rely on himself. It's useless even if we head over now." At the next moment, as if an earth-shattering explosion, a tremendous sound rang out from the direction of the volcano. Everyone turned their heads and saw that in the direction of the volcano, it was as if an invisible palm had descended from the sky, slapping down on the volcano. The entire volcano was destroyed and collapsed. It was flattened at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye by an invisible and tremendous power. Chapter 4:18. The entire mountain range was slapped into the ground, and countless amounts of lava and volcanic ash were about to erupt. However, they were all killed by that terrifying power and slapped back into the ground. The dust in the air was also slapped back into the ground. The entire scene looked like a volcano that was about to erupt had been slapped back into the ground by someone. Everyone looked at this astonishing scene, feeling the astonishment brought about by the pure violence. Jia Wei suddenly bellowed, "All second transition warriors, come to the front! The shock wave is coming!" Although they were over 10 kilometers away, the shock waves brought about by the collision of such violent powers still sent surging sand and dust in their direction. All the conferred knights acted together, each activating their force fields and standing at the front. Bang! Countless sand and rocks collided against their force fields like bullets, and the entire team was engulfed by the sand and dust. It was as if the end of the world had come amidst the darkness. It was only after an entire minute that the shock wave passed through their bodies. The few conferred knights exchanged fearful glances. Jia Wei was extremely astonished. To think that the shock wave could still have such a prowess even though it was over 10 kilometers away. One could imagine how terrifying the power of the slap had been to shatter the volcano. Just as everyone was still in a state of fear, a small dot rapidly expanded into a human figure in the direction of the volcano. In the blink of an eye, he had already traversed a distance of over 10 kilometers and appeared before everyone. Fang Xinjian was wearing ordinary training clothes and had nothing on him. He appeared before everyone naturally. "You want me to sign the authorization letter?" Ferdinand was stunned for a moment before he walked up and said, "Yes, this is the one." He took out a document and a pen and handed them to Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian received them and scanned through them. When he saw that the total price was 3 million, his brows twitched slightly, and a hint of satisfaction flashed in his eyes. After signing the document, he said, "When will the money be transferred over?" Jia Wei said, "The money will be transferred over within 3 days. May I ask, the earlier eruption of the volcano?" He asked the question that everyone wanted to know. The earlier attack had been too terrifying. In everyone's impression, it was something that only divine-level experts would be able to do. However, it had happened right before their eyes. In the direction of the volcano, Fang Xinjian happened to be there. Although they were very suspicious, they did not dare to believe it. Was that blow caused by Fang Xinjian? When Fang Xinjian heard this question, he threw a glance at Jia Wei. Without saying anything, he threw the document to Ferdinand and disappeared. Right now, after 10 days of improvement, not only had Fang Xinjian's sword arts reached the pinnacle, but he had also reached level 28 and possessed ether organs. Right now, Fang Xinjian's lungs had completely transformed into ether organs. With each breath he took, a tremendous amount of ether particles would enter his lungs, and then the exchange of energy would be completed through his lungs. With every breath he took, the energy in his body was equivalent to an ordinary person eating a big meal. It could be said that the energy reserves in his body were constantly increasing. This was the power of a level 28 conferred knight. As long as they completed the transformation of all their organs and turned them into ether organs, they would have an almost endless amount of energy and would never have to worry about exhaustion. Of course, Fang Xinjian's prodigious astral divine powers waves had also finally reached level 8. The earlier eruption of the volcano had been caused by him using terra ingurgitation. Therefore, Fang Xinjian's attributes were now: name Fang Xinjian, age 18, occupation Heavenly Sword, sovereign level 28, strength 282 plus 16, agility 297 plus 16, reaction 198, endurance 176, flexibility 175, ether synchronization rate 90%. The attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 16 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance and agility attribute techniques. Boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, Level 40 Prodigious Demolition Sword Physique, Level 40 Universal Truth Longsword, Level 12 Ether Divine Art, White Bone Divine Weapon, Heaven's Volition Sword Intent, Ether Sword Ripples Internal Specialties, 213 External Specialties, 8 Waves Level 8 Universal Sword Dominance Lunisolar Mental Cultivation Method Level 7 Universal Sword Dominance Lunisolar. This time around, Fang Xinjian had come to the mouth of the volcano to train his sword arts against the calamity. The final Terra Ingurgitation was to test out the prowess of the Level 8 Terra Ingurgitation, which could gather the gravity within a range of 8 kilometers. With Fang Xinjian as the center, the 8 kilometers of gravity gathered together, and its prowess was 512 times stronger than the initial Terra Ingurgitation. Even though Fang Xinjian's sword arts cultivation had reached the pinnacle, he was still unable to control it. Otherwise, the earlier sword attack would not have destroyed the entire volcano. It would have merely stopped and suppressed the eruption. The Archbishop from the Holy See of Truth frowned and said, "You're saying that after you guys left, an extremely ferocious power suddenly appeared and caused the entire volcano to collapse, smashing it into the ground and leaving behind a deep crater? Moreover, even the lava was blasted back, and the volcanic ash didn't erupt." After asking Jiao Wei for a few details, the Archbishop sighed and said, "Ferocious, it's really ferocious. This instantaneous explosive force is something that only the few people at the very top of level 29 are able to achieve." Gardner asked puzzledly, "But Fang Xinjian, can he really do it? Was it done by someone else?" The Archbishop smiled, threw a glance at the guards and said, "All right, you guys can take your leave first. Also, don't tell anyone about Fang Xinjian." "Yes." A short moment later, after ascertaining that there was no one else in the surroundings, the Archbishop looked at Gardner and said, "Gardner, haven't you always been curious as to why I give Fang Xinjian such preferential treatment?" A gleam flashed in Gardner's eyes. This was indeed what he was feeling puzzled about. Ever since the day of the sword learning competition, the Archbishop had been taking the initiative to give preferential treatment to Fang Xinjian in his negotiations. He had even increased the royalties and accelerated the disbursement of funds for the martial techniques grading plan. The Archbishop said, "It's because he looks like a person." "Looks like a person?" Hearing this, a hint of disapproval flashed in Gardner's eyes. "So what if he looks like a person?" However, at the next moment, the Archbishop mentioned a character that made Gardner's teeth chatter. 18 years ago, you weren't working in the Holy Inquisition court yet. Therefore, you've never met him." Gardner was stunned for a moment and his eyes narrowed slightly. 18 years ago. 18 years ago. Could it be that you're talking about? The hair all over his body stood on end as he looked at the Archbishop in disbelief. The Archbishop nodded. 18 years ago, the Pope went missing, and ever since then, the Church of Universal Truth has been split up. The 3 saints each have their own opinions, and the 16 Guardian Kings each have their own opinions. It was only last year that things came to an end. Cold sweat dripped down from Gardner's forehead. "From what I know, all the popes in the past have been saint. They are heartless and have no brothers or sisters, nor do they have any descendants. However, to think that Fang Xinjian looks exactly like the previous pope. Could it really be just a coincidence?" "Haha," the Archbishop laughed. "Do you really think that there's such a coincidence? To think that a rare genius in the Empire in 100 years, no, 1,000 years actually looks exactly like the previous pope? Moreover, his age is the same as the time when the pope went missing. He's 18 years old? However, this is probably not a good thing for him. Gardner, I know that you have the Guardian Kings and even the Saints backing you up. However, this is not a trivial matter. It's best that you pretend that you don't know anything about it. Complete the mission here as soon as possible and return. Don't delay the martial techniques grading plan any longer." Gardner exhaled deeply. Yes. Chapter 419. A few days later, Fang Xinjian looked at Zhou Xingwen and said, "Has the money for the martial techniques grading plan been transferred to your account?" Zhou Xingwen nodded and said, "That's right. All 15 million has been transferred to your account. I don't know how it happened so quickly. They said that they would only distribute the money after going through all the document. But today they suddenly told me that the money has been transferred to your account." Fang Xinjian nodded and looked outside. Ferdinand had also walked in. Zhou Xingwen said in astonishment, "Could it be that the authorization fees have been transferred to your account as well?" Ferdinand's brows twitched. "Old Zhou, how did you know?" At the next moment, he reacted. "Could it be that the money from your side has also been transferred to your account?" The two of them exchanged a glance and then looked toward Fang Xinjian, saying, "Xinjian, from today onward, you'll probably be the richest man in the Great Western region." The two of them looked at Fang Xinjian with gazes filled with envy. A total of 18 million. After deducting some of the commission and administrative fees, there would still be about 16 to 17 million. Moreover, it would be February in a few days' time, and the money for the next month's prodigious astral divine powers waves was about to arrive. Fang Xinjian would have close to 20 million in savings. If a comparison had to be made, 20 million would be equivalent to several hundred billion USD on Earth. And Fang Xinjian, who had received this sum of money, would be one of the richest people in the entire world, let alone the entire Great Western region. However, Fang Xinjian would not be able to keep this money for long. It was because he would soon finish spending all of it, turning it into various attributes, specialties, and mystical prints. To him, his own abilities were the most important. Ferdinand said, "Hildebrand has invited us to participate in the auction this time around. It's said that this is the first auction after the new year. Everyone has a lot of money and there will be many good items in the auction." "Xinjian, do you want to participate?" Fang Xinjian nodded. "Then I'll participate." Over 10 minutes later, Ferdinand and Zhou Xingwen walked out together. Zhou Xingwen looked at him and asked curiously, "Ferdinand, I heard that there was a huge explosion at the volcano and the entire mountain was blown up. Do you know what happened? Does this have anything to do with Xinjian?" Hearing that, Ferdinand was stunned for a moment and said, "I don't know." However, after giving it some thought, he added, "There might be people training there." Zhou Xingwen couldn't help but turn around to look at Fang Xinjian's room. The awe in his eyes grew stronger. Outside the great western city's gates, a man who was over 2.5 meters tall and dressed in beast skin stood there like a wild beast. He grinned as he looked at the great western city's gate. A guard came up and asked, "Big guy, how long are you going to stand there? Do you know you're blocking the road?" The man's head didn't move, but his eyes looked down in fright, revealing a trace of a smile. But with just a glance, the soldier was like a rabbit that had seen a tiger. His entire body stiffened, his body trembled, and he couldn't say a single word. Until the burly man gently patted the soldier's shoulder. "I'm sorry, I understand." After a long time, the soldier finally reacted. When he turned his head to look, the burly man had already disappeared. Who on earth was that person from earlier? Tai Nua, who was ranked 5th in the regional academy and had just returned from traveling for a year, was walking on the street. His 2.5 meters tall figure attracted people's attention wherever he passed by. Thinking of what he had gained in the past year, great emotions surged in his heart. 1 year ago, when he had left the academy, his goal had been to train his martial will and prepare to strive for level 29 with an ether synchronization rate of 100%. 1 year later, not only had he become a level 29 expert, but he had also received the legacy of the ancient great technique, the Gates of the Netherworld. Looking at the formation diagram in his palm, his eyes were filled with confidence. The Gates of the Netherworld was a powerful killing technique that involved space and time. After cultivating this killing technique, The cultivator's palm would have a door that led to an alternate dimension. The alternate dimension was a cube that was about 100 meters in length, width, and height. Tai Nua could store any matter that his palm came into contact with into the alternate dimension and then release it at any time. Everything that was stored in the gates of the netherworld would enter a state where time was almost at a standstill. Therefore, the speed at which one entered would be the speed at which they would come out. The state in which one entered would still be the state in which they would come out. The only disadvantage was that it could not store living things. Despite this, it was still terrifyingly powerful. With the gates of the netherworld, it meant that Tai Nua could absorb all the attacks from his opponents and then return them in the same state. Regardless of whether it was light rays, shock waves, explosions, cold winds, or thunderbolts, he would be able to absorb all of them and then return them. With such a terrifying killing technique, Tai Nua would have the confidence to return to the Great Western region and fight for the first place in the Great Western region. He would then participate in the national selection as the first in the Great Western region and become the first. As long as I have sufficient resources and enough experts to fight, my gates of the netherworld will have almost limitless potential. For the past 3 months, I've fought in the 8 regions alone and challenged several hundred dojos. There are over 100 types of astonishing killing techniques stored in the gates of the netherworld. Tai Nua stood on the rooftop of a tall building, looking down at the Great Western region that was filled with people. He suddenly felt that although the world was big, there was no one who could match up to him. As long as I'm given time, with the gates of the netherworld, I'll be invincible. And the Great Western region is just the beginning. Odysseus, Hildebrand, Xiao Tianxia, the top 3 in the regional academy. You guys are just the beginning. At the thought of this, his expression became even more exhilarated. With a series of flashes, he brought along a series of violent gales as he headed toward the aristocratic district in the Great Western City. It just so happens that I've also gotten my hands on a batch of ancient treasures. After selling them off, I've earned about 2 million gold. Hildebrand has invited me to the auction organized by him, so I've made a trip there to spend this money. After spending this 2 million gold, the prowess of my gates of the netherworld will definitely increase by another level. 2 million gold. This was a figure that Tai Nua would not have dared to imagine a year ago. However, right now, it was something that he had completely grasped in his hand. 2 million gold. Even a rich man like Hildebrand Brotherhousey probably doesn't have 2 million gold in liquid funds on hand, right? Thinking of Hildebrand's astonished expression when he placed his bid, Tai Nua could not help but feel excited. After arriving at the auction and showing his knight emblem, the attendant revealed a slightly astonished expression. Lord Tai Nua, you're back? I heard that you've become very famous in the Eastern Rain region. You single-handedly challenged 12 dojos in the Great Thunder Alliance. You're invincible. Tai Nua gave a soft reply and casually tossed out a gold coin. The attendant immediately broke into a smile. Tai Nua said, "Get me a private room." The attendant happily took the gold coin and led Tai Nua to the private room. As he walked, he asked the attendant what items would be up for auction this time around. Right at this moment, amidst the hubbub of voices, a group of people clustered around a youth with an indifferent expression as they walked in. More than 10 men and women looked at the youth with fawning expressions, and all sorts of praises flowed out endlessly. Chapter 420. Xinjiang, I heard that the martial techniques grading plan has given out quite a lot of money this time around. It's been reported in the papers that it's going to cost over 10 million. That's nothing. With Xinjiang's talent, I think it won't be a problem for him to lead the entire martial techniques grading plan. That's right. With Xinjiang's sword arts cultivation, it's just a matter of time before he attains the divine level. Tinan frowned and looked at the crowd leaving into the distance. He was able to recognize quite a few conferred knights among them. They were all his juniors in the regional academy. Therefore, he could not help but say, "What's with all the noise? Which family is that kid from?" The attendant smiled and said, "That's Lord Feng Xinjian. I heard that he single-handedly accepted 1% of the Holy See of Truth's martial techniques grading plan. He's the most popular unrivaled genius in the entire great western city." Genius? Tinan smiled in contempt. Other than the top three, Odysseus, Hildebrand, and Xiao Tianxia, he had never paid attention to anyone else. This was also because he had just returned to the great western city and did not know about Feng Xinjian's specific news. However, even if he knew about Feng Xinjian's reputation as a genius and the specific things he had done, he would probably still be disdainful. It was because, with the gates of the netherworld, other than purely physical attacks, he could absorb and reflect all sorts of attacks. In his eyes, even the top three, the governor and the regional chief, were just people he needed to defeat one by one. Just as he was halfway there, an eerie voice rang out from behind Tinan, "Tinan, you still dare to come back?" When Tinan heard the voice, he turned his head and saw a pale-faced, skinny man walking over. When the man saw Tinan's face, he broke into a cold smile and said to his subordinate, "Send the item to Xinjiang first. I'll head over in a while." Seeing his subordinate carrying the box and running toward Feng Xinjiang's room, the man turned to look at Tinan with a slightly vicious expression. "Tinan, you still have the face to come back? Alias!" Tinan looked at the cold man in front of him and let out a venomous voice. It was this expert who was ranked 4th in the academy. He had personally defeated him, humiliated him in front of everyone, and trampled on Tinan's dignity. It could be said that without Achilles' oppression, Tinan would not have made up his mind to leave a year ago. Tinan glared at Achilles and said, "Achilles, it won't be long before I let you know that provoking me is the stupidest thing you've ever done in your life. Tai Nua, you're still as petty as before. If you don't have the breadth of mind to cover the whole world when you cultivate fist arts alone, how can you cultivate fist arts that can dominate the whole world? Let me test the quality of your 1 year of bitter cultivation." As Achilles spoke, he took a step forward, and the auras of several hundred streams of specialty seeds gushed out from his body. The power of countless physical particles burst out abruptly, and his right fist instantly became as heavy as 1,000 caddies. When he punched out, it was as if the entire world had been filled up. In an instant, his entire body became incomparably majestic and tall. Killing technique, tyrannical fist. It was hard to imagine that the cold and gloomy Achilles would be able to perform such a violent fist technique. His disposition underwent a tremendous change in that instant. With a punch, the violent shock wave had already condensed into a huge dragon, directly colliding with Tai Nua. However, when faced with this punch, Tinan merely extended his right palm and opened up the gates of the netherworld. His palm seemed to have instantly turned into a black hole that could absorb everything. Faced with Achilles' attack, the dragon-shaped shock waves seemed to have entered a different world in that instant. They were instantly absorbed completely by Tinan's gates of the netherworld. Looking at Achilles' astonished gaze, Tinan let out a cold laugh and said, "It seems that you haven't improved much over the past 1 year. Let me test you out." As he spoke, the gates of the netherworld opened up. With Tinan's palm as the center, endless crimson light burst out, and a red meteor flew out. The moment it appeared, it seemed as if it wanted to turn the entire auction hall into ashes. It shot out toward Achilles with an aura that seemed capable of incinerating the world. "This is the big red lotus?" Almost at the instant the crimson comet appeared, over 10 conferred knights darted out together. They extended their force fields and encompassed the 2 of them who were engaged in battle. Hildebrand was the first to appear. With a slash of his palm, the space where the 2 of them were at seemed to have been sliced out. The explosive power there seemed to no longer be able to affect the auction hall. With a loud boom, Achilles took on this big red lotus. His face was covered in dust from the explosion, and more than half of his clothes were torn. He spurted out a large mouthful of blood, and his aura was weakened by over half. Violent hot air currents and shock waves surged out in all directions. However, after encountering Hildebrand's world division, it was as if they had stepped onto a path that could never be reached. No matter how the shock waves struck out, they could not reach the auction hall. Achilles was infuriated to have been seriously injured by his mortal enemy. His aura seethed once again, and he was about to activate his secret technique. Tinin! He let out a furious bellow, wanting to make another move. However, Hildebrand blocked him. Enough. Why don't you take a look at where you are? Hildebrand looked at Tinin, nodded, and said, Tinin, it's been a year since we last met. You've really improved a lot. That big red lotus earlier is an ultimate technique from the Eastern Rain Continent's Red Lotus Dojo, right? How did you learn it? Tinin smiled coldly, not saying a word. He looked at the changing space in the surroundings and thought to himself, is this the world division that's passed down in Hildebrand's family? The space in the world we're in is formed from countless fragments. He can't shatter space, but he can expand the gaps between spaces, creating the illusion that the space has been sliced up. Tinin looked at the place where he and Hildebrand were at. Although the auction hall, which was 1 meter away from them, was still in perfect condition, he could not help but feel even more wary of this world division technique. But although it's amazing, it's still a far cry from my gates of the netherworld. Achilles let out a cold snort and said, Hildebrand, I'll give you face. With that, he turned to leave. However, Tinin would not let him leave just like that. He said coldly, Achilles, you're thinking of leaving just like that? Do you dare to fight against me in the arena 3 days later? Ever since he had gotten his hands on the gates of the netherworld, he had been training diligently day and night. He had been living day and night, all so that he could return with his head held high and suppress Achilles. How could he possibly let him leave just like that? Achilles turned and looked at Tinin with a venomous expression. Tinin, are you courting death? Everyone knows who's courting death. Tinin shrugged. Why, you don't dare? That's true. You can't even take a single attack from me. How can you possibly be willing to fight against me in the arena? Tinin had used the gates of the netherworld to absorb too many attacks at the level of the big red lotus during his travels. In his eyes, Achilles was too weak to withstand a single blow. Chapter 421. Achilles was so infuriated that his eyelids kept twitching. He said, All right, then let's meet at the Academy's arena 3 days later at this time. Seeing Achilles leave dejectedly, Tinin felt extremely exhilarated. Elsewhere, Fang Xinjian was also standing at the entrance and watching this farce. His female disciple Lilia said, Master, that Achilles seemed to have sent a gift over earlier. Ever since Fang Xinjian had completed 1% of the martial technique's grading plan, the Archbishop had announced that he would be discussing with the Church's upper echelon about the second phase of their collaboration with Fang Xinjian. There might be more sword techniques for Fang Xinjian to evaluate. He did not know how much money Fang Xinjian had earned from the first phase, nor did he know the exact amount of funds for the next phase. After all, these were all confidential matters. However, it was obvious that the amount of money would only increase. Therefore, more and more people would come to him to establish connections. What a joke! How much money did the martial technique's grading plan cost? And since Fang Xinjian had managed to snatch it by himself, and even Hildebrand had not been able to win against him, there would naturally be no one else who would want to snatch it. However, if they were to bootlick Fang Xinjian, even if Fang Xinjian were to leave a small portion of it for them to do, it would still be a huge sum of money. Fang Xinjian nodded. Achilles isn't a match for him. That Tinin is a little interesting. He smiled and walked toward the door. Send someone over to ask if he's willing to come over for a chat. Fang Xinjian is inviting me over? Hearing that, Tinin's eyes narrowed and he thought to himself, this guy has seen through the wonders of the gates of the netherworld and wants to befriend me? Or is he looking into the profoundness of the gates of the netherworld? However, no matter what, Tinin did not plan on giving Fang Xinjian face. He said directly, tell him that I have some matters to attend to. Let's meet up next time. The attendant replied and retreated. A short moment later, Hildebrand pushed open the door and entered the private room, saying, Tinin, it's been a year since we last met. To think that your martial arts have improved tremendously. Tinin stood up, looked at Hildebrand with an amused expression, and said, Hildebrand, why have you come to my private room? He turned his head to look at the window at the front of the private room. He could see that the stage was being prepared, and countless ordinary guests were starting to enter. As for the other private rooms in the surroundings, they were all occupied by influential people in the great western city. Other than the auction house itself, no one knew the identities of the people in the private rooms. The entire private room had an area of more than 100 square meters, and the walls and roof were coated with multiple layers of metal. With such a great distance and the metallic coating, even a conferred knight would find it hard to use his heaven's perception to detect who was sitting inside. It provided the best privacy for the customers in the private room. Hildebrand smiled and sat down next to Tinin. It's been a long time since we last met. Do you not welcome me? Tinin found it funny. 1 year ago, even though he was ranked 5th, when had Hildebrand ever looked him in the eye? But now, he had seriously injured Achilles with a single move, and the other party had become intimate with him. This was the charm of strength. Young Master Hildebrand, how could I possibly not welcome you? Tinin said with a shrug. Hildebrand looked at Tinin curiously and said, You've improved tremendously over the past year. Did you have some fortuitous encounters? Tinin said calmly, I entered a few ancient relics and learned some small tricks. Of course, it was impossible for him to reveal the secret of the gates of the netherworld. Hildebrand smiled and did not continue to ask. Instead, he continued to get close to Tinin. Not long later, an attendant walked over and whispered a few words into Hildebrand's ear. Hildebrand said, I'll go accompany Xinjian. Feel free to do as you please. All the expenses here today will be on me. Tinin waved his hand to indicate that he understood. His eyes were already fixated on the contents of the auction. The auction had officially begun. The auctioneer revealed the first auction item. It was an almost transparent stone that was emitting hints of electricity. The auctioneer introduced, This geomagnetic essence is an exquisite item obtained from the Sand Country. It comes from the Sand Country's geocentric shrine and is a top-grade item that can raise one's body's toughness. The starting bid is 10,000 gold, and each increment must not be less than 1,000 gold. Tinin looked greedily at the geomagnetic essence on the stage. He had just reached level 29 not long ago and was lacking such an item that could strengthen one's foundations. Therefore, he said to the attendant, 50,000 gold. Therefore, the attendant raised his placard outside. 50,000 gold. The auctioneer shouted in an exaggerated manner, The guest in room number 3 has made a bid of 50,000 gold. Are there any other bidders? This is the geomagnetic essence that has been nurtured by the Sand Country's geocentric shrine for 10,000 years. It can raise one's body's toughness unrivaled. In room number 2, Hops, who was a disciple of the divine-level expert astral ancestor, was dressed in a sapphire blue long robe. He appeared very elegant, and there was a gorgeously dressed young lady seated next to him. The young lady's name was Miley, and she was the daughter of the Great Western Region's regional chief. After hearing Tinin's bid, she smiled and said, The guy in room number 3 seems to be in a hurry. Hops broke into a brilliant smile. It's true that most conferred knights need geomagnetic essence. I'll make a bid of 60,000 gold. Over the past few months, Hops had gradually walked out from Fang Xinjian's shadow and no longer treated Fang Xinjian as his target. In fact, after removing Fang Xinjian, he was considered a top-notch character amongst the younger generation. The regional chief's daughter, Miley, was a rare beauty and was also the Great Western region's regional chief's most doted daughter. Although Hops was a disciple of a divine-level expert, he was not the only young person in the Myriad Stars Palace. He also needed external help, and as the second most powerful person in the entire Great Western region after the governor, the Great Western region's regional chief was clearly a very good candidate. Therefore, during this period of time, Hops relied on his handsome appearance and outstanding martial arts talent to get along well with Miley. The auctioneer shouted, 60,000 gold. Room number 2 has made a bid of 20,000 gold. Are there any other bidders? Hildebrand returned to his room number 9, looked at the bids outside, and smiled. Both Hops and Tinin are very capable. As the organizer of the auction, he was naturally happy about this. Congratulations, elder brother. You're going to earn a huge sum of money again, Peter said. But that Fang Xinjian is really arrogant. He keeps putting on a cold expression, as if everyone owes him a huge debt. Thinking of how Fang Xinjian had shown no reaction when he had gone to express his goodwill earlier, Hildebrand frowned slightly and said, right now, he's in the limelight. It's better not to offend him head-on. Have you found out anything about the volcano? Peter said, we didn't manage to find any witnesses. When the volcano erupted, the villagers had all evacuated. Elder brother, do you really doubt that Fang Xinjian can suppress a volcano single-handedly? It's best to be careful. Fang Xinjian can complete the cultivation of over 1,000 sets of sword techniques within a few days. Do you think that he's only as strong as he appears to be? Hildebrand said, we still have to think of a way to find out more. Thinking of this, he turned his gaze toward room number 3, where Tinin was. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.